Thank you. Can I encourage those of you to grab your breakfast and take a seat so we can get started? Thank you all. Good morning. I'm Rosen Wartell, and I have the great honor and privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute and also of welcoming you here today, those of you in the room and those of you joining us now or in the future, our webcast audience. I want to thank you all for being here for really an important discussion about how the tax overhaul of 2017 will be likely to impact the resources that are critical for enabling people and places to bridge the opportunity gap. So much of the discussion about the impact of this big and consequential law has been about other issues, and we really want to make sure that we're digging into and understanding the way that this bill will affect many of the efforts of those in the room and elsewhere to try to help make places thrive and help low and moderate income families succeed economically in challenging times. I want to encourage everyone in the audience today to join the dialogue. We all have these things with us, and I hope you'll refrain from checking your email too often during them, but use them instead to join the conversation. You can tweet, and if you look on your program schedule, you'll see that the Twitter handles of all of our program participants are listed on the program schedule, so you can comment and involve them. And please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. When you're talking, because that allows everybody to follow along on the same conversation. For those of you in our virtual audience, if you're turning into the webcast live, you can submit questions to events@urban.org at any time during the program and indicate where you'd like them to be brought up, and we'll hand them forward to the moderators during the conversation. I want to first say a special thanks to our co-sponsors, the people who actually suggested that we put this idea together. Co-sponsors aren't quite the right word to describe the partnership that our organizations have and the shared focus and mission with the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC, who's been working in communities in need for nearly 40 years. And we have so many great friends working there, and we have Matt Josephs and Morgan Harper and their leader, I guess I can still say new leader. You get to be new. I'm 6 years in, and I like to say I'm the new kid in town. So you're definitely still the new leader, the very exciting, dynamic Maurice Jones, who is, LISC is really lucky to have gotten to come kind of take them to even the next level. Here at the Urban Institute, we are a place that tries to bring analytics and rigorous research into the conversation directly to help make it relevant and actionable in communities. And our goal, as always, is, we like to say, to elevate the debate. The Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center was a go-to resource throughout the debate about the creation of the, I'm going to get this right, the Tax Cuts and Job Act. Some of us might come up with other names for it. And we're very excited about the way that urban scholars have contributed mightily to not only we saw ways in which, as the bill was being debated, the hard questions that were being asked about its consequences and the distributional effects and economic growth effects of the various iterations and proposals. As those questions were asked, the bill evolved and changed. Not in every way, but I think also the TPC's work really helped to shape the public's understanding today of the consequential ways in which the bill has benefits for many, but where the incidence of the bulk of those benefits are, and we're very proud of our work. And we're also really pleased of the work that we've been able to do on one of the bill's key provisions, which I hope we'll talk about more today, the opportunity zones, kind of less noticed provision in the bill, which, as my colleague Brett Theodos, who's been doing important work on this, has recently commented, could prove, because it's an uncapped tax expenditure, to be the single largest economic development program in the federal budget, depending upon whether or not its design is proves to be workable or not, and there's a lot yet unknown about that. Look forward to hearing that conversation today. So we're going to focus in the conversations on how provisions in the new bill are likely to affect long-term economic growth, economic mobility opportunities for low-income families, corporate behavior in terms of investing in facilities, equipment, and the workforce, as well as the impact of the legislation on the ability of cities and, as we were talking with the Congresswoman just now, importantly, rural communities to finance economic development. For those of us in Washington, understanding this situation is critical for policymaking. This bill is going to have pretty monumental effects for some time, and it also, probably not as much the focus of today's conversation, will have some pretty significant effects on our fiscal situation and including effects on the degree to which we have economic resources available to invest in some of the problems that are going to be discussed in the panels coming on. We've got a great group of people lined up, and I'm going to leave it to our moderators to do the introductions, because if I pick out a few, I will not be able to credit all of the great people who are partnering here. But I will say that we're really pleased to have many of our long-term partners and collaborators here, and I see Doug Holtz-Eakin, who probably needs a chair, but who we look forward to joining us. So with that, I just want to say thanks again to LISC and turn it over to my good friend Maurice Jones to interview the Congresswoman. Thank you all for being here.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I want to say thanks to Sarah and her team for partnering with us and pulling you all together. I want to say thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks to Matt and Morgan and the folks at LISC. Oh, I see other LISCers down as well, huh? No work up in New York these days? In D.C.? It's nice to see everybody here. Just a little brief sort of intro for us. LISC, at the end of the day, our primary job is to invest and bring other investors with us to invest in communities all across the country to help them transform into sustainable communities of opportunity. We've invested about $20 billion in 40 years. We've leveraged about $60 billion. Fundamental to our abilities to invest ourselves and to bring partners with us are tools that we use often from the federal government. Low-income housing tax credits, new markets tax credits, and others. And so this conversation today about this recent piece of legislation, I know it's jobs and taxes and jobs, whatever you want to call it. For us, the real question is how we collectively utilize this to continue to invest in places that, with investment, can grow, without a doubt. And so I'm delighted to be here talking with you about this topic this morning. I'm also most delighted that we're going to have a conversation with Congresswoman Terri Sewell this morning. Now, full disclosure, I met Terri 1986 when I had an afro. Wait, that's not funny. And she looked as youthful as she looks today. So I promise not to go off script in the introduction, so I will stay on it, but I do know some stories. And so, but the problem is she does too. And so I'm gonna stay out of trouble. Terri's in her 4th term representing Alabama's 7th district, the holy civil rights district, or one of the holiest civil rights districts in our country. She sits on the Ways and Means Committee. She's also a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. She serves as the Chief Deputy Whip for the Democratic Caucus. Prior to her election in 2010, The Congresswoman was the first black partner in the Birmingham law office of Maynard, Cooper, and Gale, distinguishing herself as one of a few black public finance lawyers in the entire state. She didn't go to the University of Virginia, but that's okay. She took as a consolation prize Princeton University. And then she was at Oxford, and then she went on to the Harvard Law School. Join me in welcoming my friend Terri Sewell, Congresswoman. So we hanging out in the middle? Is that what? Oh, this is great.
Oh, they give us little name tags.
Name tags. Okay. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to have you with us.
Absolutely.
I'm going to stay on script, I promise. So let me jump right in. We've got 20 minutes, and I know there's a timekeeper somewhere. There you go. And so I'm going to stay on script. So you represent a district that includes Selma and Birmingham, cities that were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. Some would argue that ensuring equal access to economic opportunity should be a fundamental objective in all things that we do at the federal level, if not a basic right. Tell us more about your district. Walk us through how you see the federal government's role in partnering to create economic opportunities for your constituents.
Well, let me first start by saying thank you all. Thanks, Sarah, for your invitation here. And I want to thank Liz, and I really want to thank Maurice. Maurice and I were in graduate school at Oxford together many, many years ago. We've both done all right, considering.
I'm still chasing her.
So I really want to just say thanks for all the wonderful things that Liz does across this nation. I look forward to partnering and working with you to hopefully get some of those resources from my district.
I knew that was coming.
I'm shameless, right?
I knew that was coming.
Let me start by just sort of also telling you a little bit about my district. So my district is the 7th Congressional District of Alabama. And prior to getting elected in 2010, the last time I lived and worked in Washington, I was an intern for my member of Congress who held this exact seat. His name was Richard Shelby. He's now my U.S. Senator. He's now a Republican. He used to be a Democrat. I know you think that Maurice and I are 30. So it was a long time ago, but for me, this is a full circle moment. The district I represent is my home district. It includes Birmingham as the largest city in my district, Tuscaloosa, Roll Tide, for any of those who are out there. University of Alabama is in my district. Selma, my hometown, as well as a lot of rural communities around Selma. Selma is sort of the heart of a whole bunch of rural communities. 70% of my district is urban, 30% of my district is rural. And I grew up in the rural part. I grew up in Selma. The median income for a family of 4 in my district is $34,000. 45% of my district make less than $25,000 a year. My district is a majority minority district, is 61% African American. And I did tell you it's my home district. So I know what's possible from my district with a little bit of opportunities, well, a whole bunch of opportunities, and a little bit of resources. And my job every day is to try to provide those same opportunities and resources for the folks back home. What do I see as sort of the federal government's role in that? Well, I really think that when we talk about the opportunity gap, I think that federal government should be in the business of helping to provide basic services, good education, health care. I think that in order for my district to prosper, the basic infrastructure has to be there. And the reality is that we are woefully lacking in the basic infrastructure. Many of my district still have dial-up in the rural parts of my district, so broadband is still very much needed. There are parts of my district, Lowndes County and Wilcox County, Lowndes County where my mommy's from, which, you know, water and sewer issues are predominant. In 2018, to not have sanitary conditions in homes is unacceptable across America, frankly. Yep. But as you know, just as we rolled out electricity, we should be rolling out broadband. It's become that critical in closing the opportunity gap. So basic services, I think that the Federal government can incentivize the world we want to live in. So I think to incentivize economic development in underserved and distressed communities is pretty important. I think the tax code is a great place to do that. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's really critically important that we get the basic infrastructure. You know, government's good at providing and giving the groundwork for basic research that leads to innovation. You think about the shuttle and all the great things that have come from the space shuttle. But innovation is important, so spurring innovation and economic development. So those are the sort of the basic things that I think that government is good at. I think we're good at, we could be better, obviously,
Yep.
but I think incentivizing the world we want to live in is critically important, and we can be a conduit. I don't think that the government in and of itself is the provider, but you know, in and of itself is the answer, but it can be a conduit for creating better communities.
So LISC, one of the things we do is we operate with partners, these entities we call financial opportunity centers.
Mm-hmm.
Within them, we have a coach which provides, we have 87 of these around the country, not one in Birmingham yet.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things we do is we provide a coach that helps folks who are eligible for benefits actually get them, obtain them, and they're not obtaining them at the time that they reach us. One of the biggest is the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Absolutely.
Right? There's still billions of dollars being left on the table every year by folks not taking advantage of that. Two-part question. How can we better ensure that families actually claim the Earned Income Tax Credit and benefit from it? Because we've seen it transform people's lives.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then secondly, how can the what I call the Taxes and Jobs Act, I know that's not technically right.
You don't know. You don't want to know what I call it.
I know. That's why I'm saying that.
We're not going to be partisan today.
Give us your sense of the impact that it will have in supporting and investing in working families? So two-part question. So
first of all, Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit have been proven tools that work to get people out of poverty. And so to the extent that this new law actually increased the Earned Income Tax Credit, that's great. As you said, people are not accessing it. And the reality is that I just told you about my district. And in the state of Alabama, only 18% of the people who could qualify for it actually signed up, actually on their, claimed the credit on their income tax. Only 18%, 18.7, so maybe you round it up to 19. But that's Alabama. And so many more could apply for it. I also think that we could have done better on the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a proven tool to get people to lift people out of poverty. In fact, there was a study done, I think, by the University of Alabama that was between 2011 and 2013 in the state of Alabama on 152,000 families over a 2-year period were lifted out of poverty in Alabama just because of the tax credit and because people were able to, working families were able to have more money in their pocket, could provide for child care. It just was a great thing. And frankly, there was an amendment that I offered that several folks co-sponsored when we were debating in the Ways and Means Committee this new tax law. I had only just gotten on Ways and Means maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks before, and it was a marathon long, you all know, because I'm sure you guys were monitoring it, in which we as Democrats were allowed to provide amendments. None of the amendments were accepted, but one of the amendments I think that I would have liked to have seen in the Earned Income Tax Credit is, I would have doubled it. I would have doubled down on it and doubled it. Secondly, I would also have extended it to childless working adults, because there are a lot of African American men who could be lifted out of poverty, who are part of the working poor, that if we gave a tax credit like that, because they're childless, are not allowed to sort of take advantage of that. So I think that's something that we could have done to improve it. What was the second part of your question?
The first part was, how do we ensure that more families
So
actually?
what I would do is pre-fill forms. I mean, the reality is the IRS has the information. Why not, provide pre-filled tax forms where people really can see and they can make the corrections and the improvements or whatever. But I really think that we can move towards streamlining the forms. I mean, one of the things that my Republican colleagues and our chairman, Kevin Brady, kept saying was simplification, simplification. Well, pre-filling the form would be a real simplification, and it's something that we should think about. So.
Okay, good. Let's turn to the private sector. You mentioned infrastructure investments before. What are you got to sell your district to the private sector. What for you are the key selling points to attract private capital to your district? And if you could only pick two, what would be the infrastructure investments that you would put in place, execute on, to make it even more investment worthy?
So first of all, one of the things that I have, and I've been in office now 8 years. Can't believe it's been 8 years. But one of the things that we, as a staff, my staff and I, as an office, really focused on was economic development. How can we leverage the assets of this district that is poor to benefit the district? Now, the assets of the district are, well, tourism, civil rights district is really important. Tourism, and how can we leverage that bridge in Selma to help economically revitalize downtown Selma? New market tax credits, historic tax credits, private activity bonds, and low-income housing tax credits. So when I think about the tools that are in the tax code that can help benefit and leverage my district, it's that. University of Alabama and UAB, Mercedes-Benz, all of those are in my district. So the challenge for me is how do I leverage that to benefit my district and encourage private capital to combine with public capital to do that. And I think that in the code, the historic tax credit, now a lot of them were on the chopping block initially. I'm very glad though that they survived this new tax law, so they're all still viable. When I think about what helped revitalize my district after a horrible tornado, I'd been in office maybe 4 months, and Alabama was hit by tornadoes that were horrible and really decimated parts of Tuscaloosa, literally 4 or 5 months before football season. So we were working hard to revitalize so we can get ready for football season. But one of the things that helped us a lot was low-income housing tax credit. In fact, one of the oldest public housing complexes in Tuscaloosa, Rosedale Court, was renovated. Well, it was decimated. They rebuilt it. Beautiful. It's amazing, and it was totally done through low-income tax credits, and is a 188 public housing apartment complex that's doing really well in Tuscaloosa.
So let me go off script a little bit, but connected. All right. So you divide your 30% of your district is rural.
30% is rural.
70% urban. So if you could pick one infrastructure investment in the rural area that would make it more attractive to private investors, what would it be?
I guess it would be new market tax credits, although private activity bonds for hospitals and for universities are critically important. And so as a former bond lawyer, I've used new market tax credits to really help revitalize some of the downtown areas, mostly in urban parts of the state of Alabama. But there's no reason why we can't use them for the rural parts as well. And when I think about what the city of Selma is doing to sort of package itself, it's the historic tax credits that they're touting, new market tax credits, getting that allocation. There's a queue in the state of Alabama for those kinds of credits, as the same is true for low-income housing tax credits. And so, oftentimes the rural areas are just, people, the energy behind them is not the same. We really are competing with urban areas like Birmingham, like Montgomery, and Mobile and Huntsville, which are really the big cities that are dynamically growing in the state of Alabama. We're competing against them. So if I had to sort of say what I would want overall, the two tools, probably new market.
Would that be urban and rural?
Yeah, if we could figure out a way to do that. And private activity bonds, I mean, I've just seen the difference it's made in hospitals and in universities in my district. So those probably are the two, although historic tax credits and low-income housing tax credits are important as well.
So,
I mean, and I just want to say, for the record, that I think that it's really important for this, when I think about this tax, and maybe this is a question that you're going to ask later on, but when I think about this tax law, opportunity zones are perhaps the biggest potential economic development tool in this law. Now, I say potential because, it has to, the state of Alabama, our governor did designate huge parts of Alabama to be in the opportunity zone, more urban than rural, although she did designate a few of my rural areas to be opportunity zones. Now, I know I'm talking to a lot of economists here, and I know that this is sort of place-based, strategies for giving preferred tax treatments and encouraging public and private investment. But I think, and I know the jury's out about, because, sort of this sort of place-based versus people-based or whatever strategies, or the jury's still out about empowerment zones and others. But I do believe that there is huge opportunity in these opportunity zones. And in fact, was really, Tim Scott, Senator Scott, let me review the legislation before he entered it, and I pushed it on our side because I think that it has great potential to be really helpful to communities across the board, urban or rural. But I think a lot of it has to do with targeting and whether or not we're choosing the right areas and the right locations to make it succeed. So we're really, I think that the jury's out on it, but so I think that the opportunity zones that we choose to focus on first will be really important. We need, to the success and survivability of this particular form of, this tool will be based on that. So, I think that opportunity zones could be a really big deal.
I assume you think coming out of this new act, the Taxes and Jobs Act, that the opportunity zones offer the most promising tool to attract new investors to your district.
Yeah, right. I do.
So we're going to be talking about this for the bulk of this morning, opportunity zones and the rest of the legislation. Give us 2 points that we should keep in mind as we are discussing pros, cons, and most importantly, where opportunity lies in this legislation.
So, look, I think that if I sort of had to leave you all with 2 thoughts of how you can help benefit distressed communities, that's my focus, and so I'm hoping that you will take that as a focus for you, because it's critically important, I think, if we're going to close the opportunity gap in America, that we uplift everyone in America. And right now, the rural communities and inner city urban areas are desperately in need of help. And I can tell you for a fact that what we lack in economic prosperity in my district, we more than make up for in heart and spirit and in fight. What we need is not a handout, it's a hand up. That's absolutely true. And that people do want to work if they have opportunities. And that's why I think the earned income tax credit is so great, because it encourages work, it incentivizes work. You're not discouraging work. And I think that what I hope will come out of all these wonderful bright minds is how we can make the tools we currently have more accessible to a broader swath of communities. And the big cities always sort of win out when you think about it. It's the smaller cities, like Birmingham is it's a mid-sized city. Selma, can we pilot programs in rural communities to try to close the opportunity gap there? When I think about what keeps me up at night, it's the future of work. It desperately keeps, I get exposed to Silicon Valley, and I'm going out to Seattle on Friday with Ways and Means. The Democratic Caucus of Ways and Means is going to do our retreat out in Seattle. And I know I'm going to come back major anxiety. Why? Because the folks back home, the skills gap is real already. The future of work is just going to widen it if we don't figure out ways that we can double down on providing better infrastructure, first of all, basic services, and then layer that with seeing the economic opportunities that are in rural America. We can't encourage everybody to go to city centers, and I know some economists think that that's kind of where we're going. But I grew up in a Mayberry type town, and now it's crime ridden. It's, you know, Selma's now only 19,000. We lost our military base back in the 70s. It was a huge exodus of people just because of the BRAC closing, and we've seen it go down, down, down. And then the world comes to Selma for the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March to march across the bridge, and they keep on marching. They don't spend any money in Selma. They're not. So I've got to figure out a way to leverage that. So we've put a museum, the Park Service, using the federal government as an anchor. Park Service is a Selma interpretive center. Without earmarks, it's hard for me to actually get it finished, but we're working on it.
Is that an argument for earmarks?
It is. It's a good tool for those who are listening.
Not on the agenda today.
But you know, if we can get we can develop this Selma Interpretive Center into the National Voting Rights Museum it deserves to be. That could serve as an anchor. It's right downtown at the foot of the bridge, has amazing views of the bridge. You know, but we need private investment because we need hotels that are right nearby. And there's a hotel that's totally been, you know. Anyway, so I think that we need thinkers like you all to start thinking outside the box about how we can use the current tools that we have in our toolkit to help advance distressed communities, but what ways can we target, in particular, certain types of communities that are literally dying on the vine. And I would submit to you that we should include rural communities as a part of that.
So toughest question. National champion, Alabama, Auburn.
Oh, that's an easy one. Roll Tide. It's in my district. Now, you know, since I went to Princeton, I had to learn how to say Roll Tide. Roll damn Tide. Right? And I've learned really well. That which keeps me in my district is University of Alabama.
Let's thank the Congresswoman for being here with us this morning. Thanks to her.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Morgan Harper, VP of Knowledge Management and Strategy at LISC, and one of the co-organizers of the event. We're going to have a transition moment now and invite our first panel to come up, and Jean Sahadi, who will be our moderator. So, thank you.
Easy questions only.
Totally, and they're all Sure.
Full time.
I have a Larry Kudlow quote I need you to respond to.
What did I ever
I'm
do
sorry,
to you?
I shouldn't.
What did I ever do to
It
you?
just happened yesterday.
I know.
I mean,
I can guess which one this is.
it's your quote. It's free. It's okay? Hi, can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much to the Urban Institute for having me. Taxes are my favorite thing to cover. I'm from CNN. I've covered lots of things there, but this is, for some reason, my most favorite. So I'm quite happy to be here and to be here with these three awesome people who know more about this issue than probably all of us combined. Our job today is to talk about the impact of the tax law on individuals and on family income, both directly and indirectly, and also the impact of the law on deficits and our fiscal future, and again, how that affects individuals because it speaks to the resources the government will have long term. So let me introduce the panelists first. immediately to my left, although very much to the right, is Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He is currently president of the American Action Forum, a conservative think tank. He's also a former director of the Congressional Budget Office, and he was the director of the Domestic and Economic Policy Division for John McCain's 2008 campaign, presidential campaign. I think from Doug, we're going to hear the most positive take on the tax law and a particular emphasis on the business tax reforms, which he thinks holds the most promise for the middle class. Next to him is Chai-Ching Hung, who is the Deputy Director of Federal Tax Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a liberal think tank. Previously, she was a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where she taught and researched tax law and policy. And next time, I would love to moderate a panel there, because it's really pretty. She's going to take a pretty opposite view, I think, of Doug. Her broad take is more along the lines of why did we need corporate tax cuts, and to the extent we have them, do we really think that's the best way to benefit the middle class? Because as anyone who paid attention, the bill was really sold as we need to cut corporate taxes, that will help everyone, that will help wage growth and productivity and create jobs. I'll ask you this later, Doug, but I really think that everybody on the left and the right knew we needed to reform the corporate tax code, but knew politically we couldn't do it without involving individuals. And so I feel like that affected the marketing of the bill, but you tell me if that's right or wrong in a minute. I know. Okay. She's also concerned, Chai-Ching, with the gaming and sheltering opportunities that the new law creates, and she's not alone in that. People on all sides of the political spectrum have questions about that and are waiting for guidance from the IRS to answer lots and lots of open questions right now. Lastly, we have Mark Mazur, who's the director of the nonpartisan Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, which is the world's best resource for tax issues in general and also through this debate. He is a former assistant secretary for tax policy at Treasury and was a former director of the Office of Research, Analysis, and Statistics at the IRS. Mark agrees with Doug. I think we spoke about that. You agree with Doug that the business tax reforms will be have the best potential for economic growth in this law, but he has sort of broader questions about the size of the tax cuts, what the effect will be on the economy, and also whether the law actually meets the 4 tenets of good tax policy, which is simplicity. Do you understand what the hell it's doing? Do you know how to fill your tax returns out? Does it raise enough money to support the government, to support what Americans want the government to do? Is it efficient? Does it disproportionately favor or disfavor a certain type of economic activity or investment? And equity, is it perceived as fair, both between income groups and also between people who might make similar amounts of money but in different ways? Are they taxed similarly? So those are the 3 perspectives they're going to bring out. And to start, I think it would be helpful for them to sort of set the table and offer their views on the 2 or 3 ways that the tax law affects individuals positively or negatively, and also if you could give us a perspective on the magnitude of the changes, how that compares to prior tax changes that we've seen in the past, whether 1986 or 87 Bush tax cuts, whichever. Okay. Lots to choose from. Go ahead, Mark. You want to start? Go
ahead. So I think if you to focus on about 3 things in the bill, you would focus on 1, the corporate side, large cut in the corporate tax rate, a reform of the way multinational firms are taxed, and something that probably had to be done. I think the Obama administration, Chairman Camp, a number of other people talked about reducing the corporate rate to get it in line with our trading partners and to reform the international tax system. And so both of those were goals, and both of those were done. Perhaps overdone a little bit in terms of cutting the corporate rate, but was a necessary thing to do. Second, a lot of changes in the individual tax side. Generally lowering taxes for individuals by increasing the standard deduction, increasing the child credit, lowering tax rates, reforming the AMT, but also repealing personal exemptions, putting limits on itemized deductions. And so the results for individuals are going to be a little bit idiosyncratic, depending on what your family structure is, what your income sources are. And as you mentioned earlier about potential gaming areas, there's a new preferential rate for income from pass-through businesses, partnerships, sole proprietorships, and so on. These are not just mom and pop grocery stores or diners. There could be really large companies as well. And so this is one where there's a lot of potential for gaming, but also a lot of need for guidance. And I guess last point is just that the corporate changes are permanent, the individual changes are temporary. And so Congress is going to have opportunity to revisit this law as many of the provisions either phase out, phase in, or go away.
Thanks. Che-Che.
So when you put the pieces that Mark talked about together, what you end up with are sort of three big features, I think, of the bill. The first is the distribution, and my take is that it effectively ignores the stagnation of working class wages in districts like the representative was talking about, and disproportionately favours the top. So the after-tax income boost for the top 1% is about 3 times larger as a share of income than those in the bottom 60%. And it also directly harms many families by paying for the permanent corporate tax cuts with cuts to health coverage. That's another part of the law that's permanent in order to pay for those corporate tax cuts. The net total is a revenue loss that's about $1.9 trillion over 10 years. That is irresponsible in the face of a retiring baby boom generation. And there's also an opportunity cost to that in terms of the investments that we need in communities, infrastructure, other things that could help close the opportunity gap. It puts pressure on the budget to be able to afford those things. And then finally, as Mark mentioned, there are these gaming opportunities that really undercut the idea that this was reform. There are new loopholes, new distinctions between types of income that have really no economic basis. So what you will end up with is just basically a battle of the lawyers to try and keep on one side or the other of this line of getting the tax cut or not. And again, who's most likely able and benefit the most from being able to do this gaming? It's the very high income, high wealth corporations that are going to be able to make the most use of that.
Thank you. Doug.
So it's interesting throughout this debate that we essentially have the same starting point, which is deep concern over the stagnation of wages in the United States, but end up with different perspectives on the success. I mean, for me, the starting point is the fact that from the end of World War II to 2007, the crude measures of the standard of living doubled roughly every 35 years, GDP per capita. All the projections turned that into 75 years going forward. So we're seeing the American dream just too far off over the horizon. In 2016, it was not even that good. Households that worked full-time for the full year saw a 0 increase in their real incomes. And so something needed to be done about that. And the core of that, from an economics perspective, is productivity. And what you need is to have innovation, investment, capital deepening in the United States to raise productivity, and the tight link between productivity and compensations in the data. I think the business tax reforms are crucial to that. Our corporate code had sent a very clear message to our most successful companies. It said, if you have a clever investment in any intellectual property, please park it somewhere. Ireland's a nice place. New Zealand might be a good place, but not here. You might want to put the production there too. Certainly if you earn any money overseas, do not bring it back. And if you're involved in a cross-border merger or acquisition, put the headquarters somewhere else. And that's why the New York Stock Exchange, the iconic symbol of American capitalism, is headquartered in the Netherlands for tax purposes. That had to change. And this set of reforms does that. The incentives are to invest and innovate in the United States. There's expensing. There's an internationally competitive rate. We've moved to a modern territorial tax system. We have a, quote, patent box, which says to companies like Apple, please bring the IP here, don't put it somewhere else. All of that, I think, it has great promise to improve productivity in the United States and stop the stagnation of wages. That's the best thing that could happen to the middle class. I think that, I agree with Mark, I think the business tax reforms on the C Corps are the best part of this. You want to, as a matter of good tax policy, do something for the pass-through entities that's comparable, so you have a tax playing field that's level between them, and more than a half of business income goes through pass-throughs in the U.S. Some of these are quite large entities. I don't think they did near as good a job on that. That's a place where there's a lot of unfinished business. And then from my perspective, the least consequential for growth are the individual reforms. I think there's some big missed opportunities there. I would agree with the Congresswoman that extending the earned income tax credit to non-custodial parents was a real missed opportunity. We need to enhance labor force participation and work in every dimension, and that's something I probably should have been in.
Did you want to say something? I didn't know if you wanted to respond.
Oh, sure. Just on the pass-through thing, I think I disagree with Doug on the pass-through part, that it was necessary to have that comparable treatment. It was a political necessity, not an economic necessity. Pass-throughs are still taxed at lower rates than corporations, and so to say that you needed a lower rate for pass-throughs just kind of flies in the face of horizontal equity, that you want to treat similar taxpayers similarly, and we're not doing that there.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I just want to sort of seize the moment for the agreement that Doug and I have, in the sense that we are both focused on the stagnation of working class, middle class wages. We share that concern, and I think it's really sort of important to pause and note the two competing theories about how to achieve that we're starting off with. Doug's theory and the theory of the bill is that you start with corporate tax cuts. You hope that passes through to investment, that flows through to wages.
Slight correction. I wasn't interested in cuts as much as permanent reforms and the incentives embedded in them.
Okay, I prefer revenue neutral.
So that may be a difference from you and the bill, where the bill ended up with bleeding a ton of revenue through the corporate tax reform. We had sort of somewhat of a bipartisan consensus a couple of years ago around starting off with revenue neutral, and some disagreement about how you define that. We've moved far away from that to just gigantic revenue losses through the corporate code. So that this is a theory that you sort of go through investment, you sort of trickle down, I don't know if you would accept that word, into wages and communities.
Doesn't mean anything anymore. People use it. But.
Okay, well, there are a number of links in the chain. And yes. the other approach that could have been taken, which is the one that I think I would have preferred to have seen, is that instead of hoping that each of those links in the chain works, you could have directly impacted incomes of low and moderate income people through the earned income tax credit, through the child tax credit. Just to sort of note what happened or didn't happen, as Doug said, the earned income tax credit was not improved at all. Mm-hmm. In fact, because of the lower measure of inflation that's in the bill, cuts to the real value of the earned income tax credit over time are paying for the corporate tax cuts. So someone who is, moderate income, around the median income in the representative's district, would see about a $300 cut to their earned income tax credit for a family of 4 by 2027 under this bill. On the child tax credit side, there was a lot of change. There was a $2,000 increase in the maximum child tax credit. Someone with income of $400,000 gets that maximum increase.
Because they expanded eligibility for the child tax credit for people on the high end,
right,
not people on the low end.
Right, and people on the low end, in terms of low and moderate incomes, didn't get anywhere near that maximum increase. So there are 10 million children in low-income working families who will get $75 plus an inflation adjustment going forward. So that's a massive missed opportunity in terms of investing in those families, encouraging work, and particularly because of the research that we've seen in terms of how these credits help build healthier children, more educated children, and help with their labour force participation in the future.
I actually had a trickle-down-ish question, which I think Mark and Doug will, I'm going to guess I know what Chai-Ching's response is, but we'll see. The White House, Kevin Hassett, who's the head of the Council on Economic Advisors, had made an estimate that the corporate tax cut from 35% to 21% would result in some undefined period in an increase in average household income by between $4,000 and $9,000. And I think that point has been morphed into it should happen yesterday. I don't think that was his point. His point was over a couple of years. But at the time when he made this estimate, I asked a lot of economists. I don't know if I talked with you about it, but directionally people thought that was correct. They just disagreed with the magnitude of the increase that he was projecting. I'm wondering, Mark and Doug, do you think that $4,000 to $9,000, now that we know what's in the bill, we know what the interactive features are, do you think that's a fair estimate now?
I don't know. I mean, Kevin's finding is an empirical finding. There's no theory of the case laid out. It's a relationship between ultimately wages and the corporate tax rate. There's no time period specified, so it's some sort of ultimate impact. And it's focused on the tax cut piece, whereas I think the important features are the investment incentives and what you get out of that. And so it's sort of an apples to oranges comparison. I don't know what corporations will do with ultimately the pure rate cut piece. I'm more interested in the location incentives, which are very different here, and the investment incentives once it's being done in the United States. So I don't know if it's 4,000 or not. We'll see. I mean, it's important to emphasize just how early we are in this whole thing. It's going to take years and probably several thousand PhD dissertations to settle sort of the impact of this on the business community and on investment in the U.S. The earliest test case, for me at least, is the bill had this thing called a deemed repatriation. So if you're a large multinational and you'd had some overseas earnings and you'd parked it over there for a long time, the moment the president signs the bill, that money is deemed to have come back to the U.S. and you owe a tax liability on it. At that point, there's a genuine business decision to be made. Is it really better to invest it in the United States or should we keep it in Belgium? And that's an important test of the incentives in the bill, and the early indicators are promising. We've seen Apple, Cisco, and a bunch of others say, we're going to bring the money back, put it in the U.S. But that's suggestive at best. We have to see how it all plays out.
Although Donald Marin, I don't know if you're here, but he wrote a great blog post on the repatriated monies are at least initially being used to do stock buybacks, right?
But so this is a fundamental point.
No,
I mean,
just factually, just pointing
no,
it out.
But people say this a lot, and I just think there's a lot of confusion with this. So what? It doesn't matter what the initial transaction is. It matters what the ultimate use of that money is.
So in terms of investing in the U.S., even though it's a stock buyback, that money eventually will be used.
It doesn't go into a black hole. It
right.
goes out into the financial markets, and it would actually be a good thing if a firm with poor investment opportunities chose to buy back stock instead of wasting the money on their investments, let someone else get it and put it into a productive investment. Okay. So fine, there are stock buybacks, I understand that, but we need to see what is the ultimate disposition of that money and what the impact is on the economy.
Right.
So I guess I would emphasize the linkages that Cha-Ching talked about. That you have a corporate tax cut, you have a revised set of incentives. You think that's going to improve the after-tax rate of return. That's going to lead to more investment. It's going to lead to more productive capital, more productive workers, and eventually the workers get paid more. But the fact that there are all these linkages means that it's going to take a while for that to all occur. Doug's point about the stock buybacks is correct. That is money that is now being potentially reinvested in something else. Now, it was already in the U.S. financial system somewhere, just that it wasn't in the hands of the shareholders or whoever, and they get to reallocate things. On the Kevin Hassett $4,000 or $9,000, I think no one knows what the ultimate thing will be. I'm skeptical. I think it'll be much smaller, but I also think I'm kind of perfectly hedged. Either I get a $9,000 raise or I'm right.
So I just want to pick up a couple of points because
no, she does not think that is great.
There's a lot to unpack here because let's sort of pause back where your question started. At best, the promise is a $4,000 to $9,000 raise that most mainstream economists will not put their names behind, and I really recommend to you a new paper put out yesterday by the Centre for Equitable Growth that steps through how different that estimate is compared to groups like TPC or CBO. At the most responsible, which is, I'm giving credit to Doug here for the promise was, we'll see. So again, this is the choice between something that directly helps low and moderate income people versus a we'll see over time. And I'm not saying that a we'll see promise is not necessarily something to always go down the track of, but there again, there's a lot of links in that chain before people will see. The other thing to note is the question of who sees those wage increases, because most, again, of the range of estimates would say that even to the extent that this investment flows through to higher wages as opposed to higher returns for shareholders, even to that extent, the distribution goes primarily to highly paid people as opposed to low and moderate income workers. So it's executives as opposed to the factory workers that are going to be seeing the bulk of that wage increase.
Do you agree with that, or do you think that it will?
I don't know why that's the case.
So Would you like to explain why it wouldn't be the case, especially given the way that we've seen both GDP growth being shared over the last 30 years and the fact that, you know, as a first approximation, you would expect wage gains to be shared in proportion to wages?
So the key is we've changed the incentives to put real capital in the U.S. and combine it with real U.S. workers. And so the evidence from the past 30 years shouldn't be dictating how you think about this. It's supposed to be a new environment, and you ought to think about it. And the plain vanilla linkage in the data is between worker productivity and their compensation. And if this is going to improve the productivity of low skill, middle skill, and high skilled workers, they will see comparable increases in their wages.
So there's two parts of that I think it's worth dwelling on a little bit. One is whether or not that incentive actually works, and we might want to talk about some of the features of the international tax code that actually create some perverse incentives to locate investment and profits offshore. And the second part is really what happens with the location of investment and the returns to those investment in the face of $1.9 trillion added to deficits. So the idea that all of those gains flow to US workers, US investment, would be undercut to the extent that it's financed by borrowing from offshore, and some of those returns are going offshore. And that's one of the things that was debated quite a lot during the law.
Some of the borrowing is domestic, though. Just so
Some of the borrowing.
Yeah, some of the borrowing is domestic, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The general tension here seems to be, is money in the hands of workers more effective for the economy than money in the hands of companies going to workers, directly or indirectly? I'm sorry, directly.
The other difference between us, I mean, just to note
Yeah.
for the record, is think of a larger tax credit or something, sort of a one-time thing that you put into the code for folks versus the hope that the sustained increase in trend productivity growth. That's the missing link in the U.S. economy right now. Trend productivity growth is essentially zero over the past 5 years, and that needs to be dealt with. That's sustained increases, and so it is a we'll see, and it is over time, but it is, in the famous words of Paul Krugman, in the long run, productivity isn't everything, but it's almost everything. Yeah. So we need to do that.
And that's where I think the opportunity costs come in terms of, I think you and I would probably have fairly different views in terms of if we're picking a bet for a we'll see investment. I might choose things like infrastructure investment, investing directly in communities for opportunity building investments in those communities as opposed to corporate tax cuts.
And the truth is, we don't really know what drives productivity, right? We have a bunch of theories that say capital deepening, more capital should help. But as economists, we have to be a little bit humble on what really drives productivity.
So I think that's right. And the other piece of humility that I would just emphasize everyone should have is this is the first and only time the world's most successful economy will move from a worldwide to a territorial system. And we absolutely have no clue the magnitudes and how fast that's going to impact. We have some suggestive guesses from looking at other countries and things like that, but it's a very big change, and it's going to have big impacts.
And that's just another example. There's a big fiscal experiment,
yeah,
right? That
I would have loved. I mean, the level of the debate around the bill would have been so much higher if the story from lawmakers was, we have no clue and let's see, as opposed to there's going to be a $9,000 wage increase over 10 years.
It decreases employment if you write those talking points.
that's the part.
One thing I forgot to mention up top is that we're going to leave 10 to 15 minutes for questions afterwards. So if you have questions, keep them in your head and we'll pass the mic around. Now I lost my train of thought. No, terrible. Since you brought it up, the fiscal experiment, we'll just hop right to that. The reason you say it's a fiscal experiment is because we are throwing in a lot of stimulus into what is a near full employment economy, so we're throwing money at a good economy, as opposed to normally when you throw money at a bad economy to like gin it up and get it better. But Doug, you said something, when I first saw you in public, like at a conference, you told a story about talking to foreign dignitaries, and they asked you a question, what is U.S. fiscal policy? And you said, we don't really have U.S. fiscal policy,
No,
we have fiscal outcomes.
Usually bad.
Yeah, and usually bad. So I'm wondering, in this tax law, do you agree that it is a fiscal experiment in terms of it contradicts what we've done historically in terms of throwing money in a good economy? And do you think it is more about fiscal outcome than purposeful fiscal policy? And so I'll leave it at that.
For me, I liked the starting point much more, which was the House focus on revenue neutral reforms that were very pro-growth, and that's not how the end product came out. But no one gets everything they want in tax reform. That's just a rule in life. So I think it was the president's campaign promise and sort of the brokering of the deal between the House, the Senate, and the White House over the summer that led to the decision to have this run deficits, and that led to a tough decision for a lot of people because other things equal, those deficits are not a good idea. We inherited $10 trillion of deficits over the next 10 years from the Obama administration. It's a nightmare, and more is not in and of itself desirable. The question is the additional growth that you can get and the improved business taxation worth the additional deficits? And everyone had to make that call. I mean, there's no way around that. We had to do something on the corporate side. The status quo was dangerous to America. Everything was not working, so something had to get done. It as a result, constitutes this sort of aggressive fiscal push. A back-of-the-envelope calculation is that between the tax bill and the Bipartisan Budget Act, the CAPS deal, the net cash flow impact is going to be about 1.3% of GDP this year. That's big. The Obama stimulus was 1.6. So that's a lot of money being tossed at the economy, and you would expect something to happen from that. Now, the good news is we're starting in a very low interest rate, low inflation environment. We have other tools to deal with this, but it'll be interesting to watch it. There's no question.
Are you optimistic it will turn out well?
Yes, I am.
You are. Mark, are you optimistic it will turn out well?
Less so, I think, or no. It's actually kind of amusing when Doug talks about the Obama stimulus, where, I mean, I remember being criticized a lot for stimulus then, and now all of a sudden stimulus is okay.
No, I'm not endorsing that.
You're not. But, but 51 members of the Senate did, who went the other way before. So it is kind of a little bit ironic that we kind of switched to this point where it's okay to run a big deficit. And I think the key thing is this has to get paid for somehow. You don't eliminate the arithmetical budget constraint.
Right.
And so if you think about how it's going to get paid, you start to look a little bit ahead and say, well, now we have a bigger fiscal hole to dig out of. And is it going to be done across the board? Does every one of the 320 million Americans kick in some out, or is it done in accordance with incomes or some other way? But the point is it's got to get paid for somehow. And that's going to be kind of the next set of challenges for Congress and the administration to how to deal with that.
And just briefly on that note, I mean, I genuinely don't think that the bill changed the budget outlook for the United States at all. What it really did was just change the dates on the axis. What used to be a 2020 problem is now a 2018 problem. What used to be a 2022 problem is now a 2020 problem. We had big issues to deal with. They're now here.
But the hole's a little bit deeper too, right? I think that
that's true.
You had big issues to deal with, and we kind of kicked the can even further down the road than perhaps would have been otherwise.
The hole will be deeper still if we go ahead and extend the individual tax cuts, which Republicans want to do and may even try to vote on this year, although probably won't pass this year, but sometime over the next 8 years, the decision will have to be made by Congress. Do you extend these individual tax cuts? Because just like with a fiscal cliff, are you going to tell people, hey, on December 31st, 2025, you kiss those tax cuts goodbye, and we go back to the old tax code, essentially the old rates. And a lot of people think that Congress will do what Congress does, which is to extend the tax cuts. So the hole gets even deeper, and the CBO projects instead of $1 trillion annual deficits, we will accelerate to $2 trillion deficits by 2028.
I think in terms of this, I think there's a little bit of a danger of a self-fulfilling prophecy about the inevitability of making all those permanent. I think when you actually look at the detail, things are, this is to your point earlier, things are a little bit different than the last time that we faced this issue. Even just the expiring provisions, making them permanent, would be another round of regressive tax cuts. The top 1% would benefit by about 2.2% of income, according to TPC. The bottom 60%, less than half of that. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a great political or policy rush to make all of those to make all of those permanent. The other thing that I think is really notable about the structure of the bill as a whole is, this budget constraint question is really, really important for the way that most low and middle income people might actually experience the effects of this bill. The eventual pay-fors may be far in excess of what they see in their paychecks through the initial tax cuts. And again, that depends on how the eventual financing is distributed. But we have some data points. One data point is how some of these tax cuts were paid for in the bill itself. So the permanent provisions, the corporate tax cuts, are paid for by cutting health coverage and an across-the-board tax cut that, an across-the-board tax increase by a slower measure of inflation. So again, the pay-fors are much more aggressive than the tax cuts over the long run. Then the other data point is just really what lawmakers who enacted this have been saying. They've been saying for years, and they've been saying it after the bill's been enacted, that they feel that the problem for deficits is sort of put taxes over there. We're not going to look at that side of the budget when it comes to deficit reduction. In fact, we'll make things worse. When it comes to deficits, they're laser focused on what they call entitlements, which is DC code language for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, housing assistance, and things that really have much more broadly felt impacts than some of the tax cuts themselves.
Did you want to say something? Can we maybe bring this conversation down to something specific? The Congresswoman's district, median income, I think she said was $35,000. A large percentage of people make less than $20,000. How does this tax law help them? And do each of you believe that the tax code is the best place to actually directly help low and middle income people get ahead? Or is it just the way Congress is willing to do it?
So I guess a couple things. One, for people at the lower end of the income distribution, the individual income tax cuts will be $50, $60, $100 a year. So not a giant amount for folks at the median income in the Congresswoman's district. Second, the question about whether a tax code is the right place to do this. As a country, we've put a lot of pressure on the earned income tax credit, largely because we don't want to raise the minimum wage. We don't want to do anything on the actual wages side of things. And so it's a great incentive. It's an important tool, probably the most important federal tool to raise people out of poverty. But we put a ton of pressure on this one tool. And it's not obvious to me that the tax code is really where we should be putting all of our bets on this.
Why do we do that, though? Is it because lawmakers can't agree on anything else?
Largely politics, right? In the sense that you get two things out of this that benefit Republicans and Democrats. Republicans get to say, we have a tax cut that's pro-work, and Democrats get to say, we have a tax cut that's really progressive.
And I think sort of in an ideal world where we're in charge of the budget, or the Senate was in charge of the budget, we would be seeing.
That's not my idea of an ideal world.
For the record. But for the ideal world for some of us, there would be investments on both the spending side and the tax code. But when you are faced with a Congress that is laser focused on the one thing that they are going to try and get done is on the tax side. And their rhetoric is around lifting the incomes of people like in the Congresswoman's district. It seems odd, especially when there's been years going into it of talking about the need to expand the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, that we came out with a bill that looks the way it does.
Right, which is primarily the child tax credit is available now to very high income people in a way that it wasn't before. They're now eligible for that.
Can I just say, sure. The way I think about this is, you sort of identify the problem you care about, which I did at the outset, and then you try to set the policy dials in the direction of fixing it, and that's what I think we did with the business tax reform. I think that was the right thing to do. But you shouldn't pretend you only have one policy, and you really shouldn't overstate the fact that tax rates or tax incentives drive the entire world. It's not true. I mean, we have other things that we are simply not doing, right? So for example, we just got the National Assessment of Education Progress a couple days ago, and we have stalled at something between 25 and 30% of our 4th and 8th graders who are not capable of reading or doing mathematics at basic proficiency. That's obscene. I mean, we need to take care of those things as well if you really want to solve problems like the Selmas in America. We need to fix those things.
So shout out for the state tax people in the room. One of the issues with education funding is the fact that, you know, deep income tax cuts in many states have led to pressure on school funding, and that's why we're seeing, you know, 4-day school weeks in some states.
Or 40-year-old textbooks.
40-year-old textbooks, yeah. Okay, I have to ask Doug this question because it came up yesterday, and he's a former CBO director. And
have to ask.
Yes, I do, because I have to have the answer to this question. So all throughout the tax debate, most economists, most think tanks, economic think tanks, believe the tax cuts would create economic growth and pay for part of themselves, but not all of themselves. The White House took a different tact and kept saying, yes, they then broadened their argument to, yes, the tax cuts will be paid for in concert with the rest of Trump's economic agenda. So not only will they be paid for, but it will generate an additional $300 billion in revenue. And that's their story, and they're sticking to it, even though the general economic community disagrees.
This is the only evidence of message discipline out of this White House, for the record. Just saying.
So yesterday, I'm just casually going through my email, and we always get transcripts of what people are saying on TV, and I get one from Fox News that Larry Kudlow, who used to be on CNBC and is now the top economic advisor of the president, said to whoever he was talking to regarding CBO's estimates of the tax cuts. Like JCT, the Joint Committee on Taxation, it does not estimate that the tax cuts will be paid for. That's why it will add to deficits. So Larry Kudlow said, never believe the CBO, never believe them. They're always wrong, especially with regard to tax cuts, which they never, ever score properly because they don't understand the growth, the incentives, and the encouragements to reward success. So as a former CBO director, were you just throwing spitballs while you were there and did not think about these issues when you were scoring tax bills?
So let me say two things about that in all seriousness. Mm-hmm. The first is the views that he states about the substance of the economic analysis. I fundamentally disagree with and think he's mischaracterizing, and am happy to go point by point through what CBO does and how carefully it does it. It uses estimates that are based on consensus in the research literature, pays attention to all the voices in this room, and I think it should have zero reason to apologize for its work. The second thing I would say is Larry's entitled to his opinion, but he's now not a CNBC commentator. He's the NEC director, and he should not be commenting on a ledge branch agency in this way. It's 1,000% inappropriate, and he needs to learn his job.
That was a good question to ask, wasn't it? Did you, I mean, and also just again through this debate, Tax Policy Center, which is just so well regarded in the academic and the policy community, you know, there's just been a lot of talk of dissing the good work. You can disagree with the conclusions, but there's been a lot of dissing of the good work of these organizations, the CBO, the JCT, Tax Policy Center, and it's, as a matter of public messaging, I think it's troubling because people don't know what to think about this tax law. Should I be for it? Is it really just for rich people? Do I get a benefit? You know, and so I just had to bring that up. I'm sorry. That was my indulgence. Let's talk about tax sheltering.
Are you offering some tips?
As soon as we get guidance from the IRS.
Yeah, well, they're busy rebooting this.
I know. Can you just explain, Mark, or any of you really, to explain what you think that the biggest risk is for tax sheltering in the bill, and maybe explain what a pass-through is and the deduction that they're going to get, why it's a problem.
Okay,
or not a problem, but why.
So first, I guess the deduction for qualified business income from pass-through is probably one of the areas that it's new, it's novel, it's a complete
Define pass-through for us.
I will. It's new, it's novel, it's a complete departure from what we've seen before, and it focuses on pass-through businesses. Pass-through businesses are sole proprietorships, so like one person owns a business. Partnerships, 2 or more people get together and run a business. Limited liability companies, subchapter S corporations. The basic theory is that they're not taxed at the entity level. The income passes through the entity to the individual, gets taxed on their individual income tax return. And these can be small businesses. If you can think of, like, you know, someone as an individual consultant or a freelance writer. It could be one-person operation. It could be a giant multi-state pipeline. There are partnerships with thousands of partners, or big accounting companies, law firms, and so on. And so there's a wide range of businesses. And what this law does is say, for pass-through businesses, if they fit into these categories, they get a 20% deduction. So basically, they pay a rate that's 20% less than individuals pay on their other income, wage and salary income. What that means is there's a strong incentive to be in the low tax bucket. And if you can find a way to, through a paper transaction, say, move yourself from the higher tax to low tax bucket, you will. And that's really where the IRS and Treasury have to put out guidance to say, here's where the lines are, because there'll be a lot of pressure for people to want to recharacterize things. And we've seen articles, Wall Street Journal and other places, that have talked about new techniques with like clever names attached.
Catch and what?
There was a crack and pack.
Oh,
there was a half and half. There probably is a catch and release. There are all kinds of different categories out there.
And they're taxed less than corporations, even with the big corporate tax rate cut?
So yeah, so corporations are taxed at 2 levels. So at a corporate level, there'll be a 21% tax under the new law at the corporate level. And then if the earnings are passed on to shareholders through a dividend, or they sell their shares capital gain, another level of tax is paid at that point. Putting those 2 levels of tax together will be greater than the 1 level of tax at the pass-through entity level.
And the IRS says it's probably not going to be putting out guidance before this summer, I think, at the earliest. But companies are already, or partnerships and so on, they're already taking some moves in anticipation that they will guess right. The other area of sheltering, which you had brought up, Chai-Ching, was individual workers who are full-time salaried benefit full workers might be tempted to go off on their own as independent contractors because of this promise of this deduction. I personally am dubious about that just because it involves so much change and loss of security if you lose your full-time benefits and trying to get a compensation to match what you had in your full-time job. But are you seeing something different? Are you
Right. So I think even before this law was enacted, there was a lot of employers that may not have been entirely on the level with their employees, trying to classify them as independent contractors in order to not have employment protections for those employers and to reduce the amount of benefits that they would have to pay. This law potentially just creates confusion that would allow those sorts of employers to sort of give their employees another reason to say this is a good idea. If they did the calculus carefully, as you might, and sort of toted up the things that are less obvious than a 20% deduction, the benefit of employment protections, the non-cash benefits, all of those other things, they might very well find that it's not worth it, particularly because a 20% deduction at fairly low pay and fairly low tax rates is not worth much. So I think this is just another area where we'll be looking to what extent the confusion potentially creates labour market tensions and has impacts on markets in ways that we hadn't perceived before. I think on the loopholes, it's really important to step back to where we were initially and remember where this all came from. Corporate tax cuts, politically this pressure to create this pass-through tax cut to give something equivalent, there being not really any economic rationale apart from that political pressure means that both the underlying provision and all of the rules that have been laid on top of it to try to keep the gaming to a minimum don't have real economic rationale either. So what you've ended up with is sort of a maze of rules that don't have a rationale that people are going to have to pick their way through, both the IRS and people that are trying to get on the right side of these things.
So you have an example of the lawyers and accountants are not eligible for this,
Right.
but architects and engineers are.
Right. Right, and maybe with more time, a better process, people reading the reports of academics during the debate that were saying cracking and packing is going to be a thing, there would have been time to do this in a more rational way. That's not where we are. Instead, we're in a place where higher income professionals and extremely high income businesses will have the most access to the tax lawyers and accountants that can help them get their way through this. And have the most ability to save money on this. at the same time that the IRS enforcement budget is down 23% since 2010 in real levels and is not being made up for with the latest omnibus bill. So I think this is going to be a really important place where folks like TPC and others will be sort of explaining what's going on the ground as some of these extremely complex, probably unseen and not baked into the cost and the distribution estimates of the bill gaming comes to light.
So I think this is one of these places where you have to say, we have this compared to what? Because every tax code comes with serious issues of enforcement of this type. And this one came with what I thought were two. And they were most visible early on in, say, the House version. The first is, you move to a territorial system, you have to identify where income is actually earned, in the United States or outside of the United States. That is a fundamentally impossible question. Think of a Star Wars movie, which is using IP located abroad and is shot in 4 locations, and you can't even keep track of where the actual income is earned. So you need some rules, you need some enforcement mechanisms for those rules. They will never be perfect. And this bill has some international enforcement and rules that are going to be comparably contentious, is my prediction. Second thing is, on the pass-through part, the way the House did this makes it a little bit clearer. The rough justice, corporate income is taxed at 20, about a quarter of it goes out to taxable entities, and it gets taxed at, say, 20%. So you add it all up, the all-in tax on an equity investment on the C side is about 25%. So what the House did was they had a 25% rate on the return to equity in pass-through businesses. But that means you have to identify which of those dollars is actually a return on equity investment. You need the same set of impossible rules, and you'll get it wrong. That was a very hard tax policy issue to begin with. The Senate, by insisting on this deduction instead of simply having a tax on the return in there, made it even more complicated. And this is going to be quite contentious. And the most vivid example of this, by the way, just for people who don't do this recreationally, is Kansas, which decided to set its pass-through rate at 0, and thus Bill Self, the head coach of the Kansas basketball team, became a business and leased himself to the University of Kansas for tax purposes. It's fantastic.
I'm sorry, did you want to say something to follow up? So, pivoting off the word complicated, one of the goals of this tax law was to simplify. Business taxes are never simple. I don't think it was fair to say they could. I don't think that was the goal. On the individual side, though, especially if you run a business, and let's discount the first year. Let's discount filing your 2018 returns, because everybody's going to be confused because it's a new system. Moving past that year, do you anticipate, Mark, that it really will be easier for the vast majority of filers to just file and not hire someone, not pay the H&R Blocks of the world or their uncle?
Well, a couple of things. I guess first, just to level set right now, probably about half of the people who file individual tax returns use a paid preparer.
Have to.
Probably another third or more use software. And so
most people use something,
exactly.
a crutch.
There's just a few people who do pencil and paper, not very many.
Right.
And getting a smaller and smaller set over time.
Probably a larger proportion in this room, I'm guessing. People do it for fun.
Or have their own spreadsheets here. Anyway, so that's the starting point. What the bill does is it takes the number of itemizers down from about a third of filers to about 10% of filers. And so that means 20% of filers, or probably 30 million taxpayers, won't have to itemize deductions because they have a greater standard deduction. That should help simplify their lives. Now you're right that in 2018, people are going to keep those exact same records that they kept last year, and then they'll be a little disappointed that they won't help them next year. But eventually their lives will be simpler. There are some other complications in here as well, but that is one of the larger simplifications that's in the bill.
Do you think people? Go ahead.
So I think it's not on net simpler, but I mean, for the vast majority of people, it's pretty simple to begin with. They have wage income and they go and they take care of it. The thing about tax complexity is most of it's self-inflicted. The complexity comes because people want those provisions. They want special targeted things, and so they lobby to have them in there. And so,
well, not individuals don't lobby for them. I mean, what do you mean? I mean, what are you saying?
You want to hold on to charity and deduct your charity?
Like a home office deduction, say, if they have a business.
Yeah,
right?
and home office deductions and a lot of these
things. So they push the envelope to get the deduction.
So a lot of the complexity is because people want special provisions. Like we used to have income averaging, right? So you could average your income over several years, and thus if you had one big year and one low year, you wouldn't pay a ton of tax on this and you'd average it out. That was complicated, but it was because people wanted that. I mean, that was, so you have to be very careful about which kind of simplification you reward. I mean,
well, but okay, I guess I'm just going to push back for a little bit as individuals because they deal with the system they've got. So if you tell me I could possibly lower my tax bill because of X, Y, Z, yes, I will stand on my head to try to do it, but I won't push for it. I'd rather it just be simple, lower the rate, and you know, mentally I'm not a complex person, so the less complexity, the better.
It didn't do that, I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't think it on net simplified.
Yeah.
Not really.
I think your intuition is why the talking point of a postcard, which was never going to come to fruition, was one that we heard a lot lot that
Who uses a
attraction.
postcard anyway?
I know, there's a lot of reasons.
Don't mail anything.
Right? A reflection of the age of the members of the committee.
So we have about 15 minutes left, and I would love to get questions from the audience, and I think you're going to pass a mic around? Okay, so the gentleman in the back went first, in the blue shirt.
Hello, my name is Carl Pulzer, and among other things, I work on financial inclusion. So I have a suggestion to sort of run by you, and it's on the Earned Income Tax Credit. So we've heard that it's a key part of U.S. policy, and we've heard from the Congresswoman that there's issues with the take-up rate. It would be better if everybody that was eligible could get it. From the right, I hear a lot of concern about the accuracy and some wastage in it. So why don't we do a compromise and build the cost of filing into the program? So provide money so that people that are eligible can get accredited help, because it's very complicated for many to file. So then you would have if this is really going to be part of our wage structure, you could, and simplify it as well. So provide $100 and accredited help.
So I guess just an observation. There's about an 85% take-up rate of the Earned Income Tax Credit, so it's a pretty large take-up rate, especially relative to other social benefit programs. But there is, 15% times a lot of people who don't claim this benefit. So there is room to improve. IRS has done a fair amount of work at sending notices out to people to say, hey, you might be eligible, maybe you should look at this. There are volunteer tax clinics and so on, at low-income tax clinics that try to promote this. But yeah, more could be done on that score.
I was surprised by the Congresswoman who said only 18% of people in her district who are eligible for the EITC apply for it. That's low.
That's way low.
That's way low. I mean, I'm not questioning your numbers, but that
I think it's 18%. No, 18% of people in her district get the EITC.
Well,
So the eligibility, I think, should just be spelled.
Oh.
Okay. Well,
Congress people never do that.
Just to sort of flag another plug for adequate IRS funding.
Yeah.
There were a couple of bipartisan bills passed yesterday, IRS reform. One of them would have made the volunteer income tax assistance program permanent. That's a great step, but they also need to appropriate funds for that. So VITA, thank you any VITA volunteers who are here, as low-income tax preparer assistance that helps people file for these taxes because, again, because of policymakers' choices about targeting so the right people get the credits, have made the rules quite complex over time.
Mm-hmm.
As a general matter, one of the reasons the EITC becomes contentious, despite the fact that it has a track record of raising labor supply, is our largest anti-poverty program. So all that's good news. It has big error payment rates, like about 23% are incorrect, and that makes people nervous about expanding it. A reason for that is it runs through the IRS, and the IRS was not originally invented to pay benefits. It was invented to take your money, and it's very good at that, but it's not the Social Security Administration, which is very good at sending out benefit checks. And if we're going to give it a continued mission with the EITC, with child credits, with ACA credits, there has to be recognition of that and a sort of reform of the IRS to be an efficient benefit administrator.
On a side note, do you think the $320 million the IRS got to administer this new tax law is sufficient? I mean, I think the original ask was $397. Oh.
So the 320 is kind of a bit of a mirage to start with because it's 320 off base, 320 on top of cuts of 124 million to its base funding. So the actual increment is much less than that. But
I think that's right. And I think the administration asked for almost 400 million, got 300 million, so got 3/4 of what they asked for. That's a step in the right direction. But whether it's enough to offset, as Chai-Ching said, like 10 years or more of sustained budget cuts, that's the big problem. And just an example, yesterday you saw the IRS have problems with getting their returns filed electronically on the day they were due. This is something, Commissioner Koskinen said several times, that their system's kind of rickety, and it's not a matter of if, but when. And we saw it happen yesterday.
Right.
I thought maybe you guys did that, so this event would be on tax day. I thought that was
Okay, any other questions? Right. Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. For all those discussions, I always feel whether you have verified the data you are using and whether the benefit go to the people who are targeted to receive the benefit. Let's say like a lot of people don't know how to read those legislation, and sometimes it's so complicated. You have to hire a lawyer. And for an uneducated person, and then with a lot of education budget, but budget itself, not only they don't use it for schooling purpose, they divert the resources to benefit some other people. So for all this discussion, unless we verify the data and accountability or reliability of those benefits, and whether they really reduce the, let's say, unemployment or homelessness. The problem is whatever money you go to benefit maybe a few corporations or their development team, but not benefit the general public or the household. So I just wonder if we want to discuss all this, whether you can ask the Congress to simplify the tax code and to verify the benefit to the general public.
Okay, so is the general question?
My general question is data accountability and really verify the benefit to the people. Because a lot of social programs, they don't benefit the people because the benefits are really diverted to benefit a few, not the general public who deserve the benefit.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm actually wondering if this is maybe a question for the next panel that's going to be looking at at public and private partnerships and investment in particular communities, and the question of to what extent the communities are benefiting as opposed to the money.
But for the individuals benefit, I mean, the work that we do at Tax Policy Center, we base on a public use file of IRS data. So it's basically data that the federal government has that they make available to us, and we extrapolate from it. The CBO and the Joint Tax Committee have, at least Joint Tax Committee has access to actual tax data, and so their information is very trustworthy, that they have really good information that they can base their decisions off of.
Any other questions? I didn't look across the room. Yes, Eric Toder is from the Tax Policy Center.
Hi, Eric Toder, Tax Policy Center. The panelists mentioned that it's going to be very hard to tell the impact of the tax cuts on investment in the economy. It's going to take a while. And one of the reasons it's always hard is because there's always other things going on at the same time. So separating that out is hard. So I was wondering if the panelists would like to comment on the impact of things that are going on in terms of trying to suppress immigration and trying to suppress trade and put tariffs on, and whether those would offset and whether how important they are.
The witness, Eric.
What?
I will. I mean, I think it's going to be a very complicated legacy if it continues on its current course. On the plus side, from just a macro impact point of view, we keep track of the regulatory costs of the entire federal government, and over the 8 years of the Obama administration, there was a major regulation finalized at an average rate of 1.1 per day, and the total self-reported cost of compliance was a cumulative $890 billion. It's over $100 billion in reg costs every year. The Trump administration in fiscal 2017 raised that total by $5 billion. They shut off the regulatory state. Stunning. And they're promising to do even more in 2018. That will have impacts that are hard to quantify or be mixed in there. On the negative side, unambiguously negative side, if you look at the sort of attempts at reducing legal immigration, and you look at the DACA catastrophe, that's going to be a negative. And the trade stuff, the steel and aluminum tariffs are an unambiguously bad idea. I mean, I was in the Bush White House when we originated this unambiguously bad idea. So, you know, we've run that experiment. Messing with NAFTA is unwise at best, and I have more vivid descriptions. And the China strategy, to me, I understand that they've identified the right culprit. I understand that doing things the same way we have in the past wasn't going to be successful, but I have yet to hear what is the end game in terms of changes in observable Chinese behavior that they want and thus would constitute success, and what are the mileposts toward that success. And those are things that I think are an essential element of an effective strategy. So in the absence of that, you've got a business community that views this as, you know, random tariffs being levied on a major economic and trading partner. None of that seems to me to be beneficial from their desire to hit 3% growth.
Or more.
Or more.
Or more, yeah.
And I think that the point that Doug made earlier about the thousands of PhD dissertations coming out of this, that's part of the jobs, part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But really, it's an indication that there's going to be a lot of interest in trying to tease out what are the effects of this act, and that there are a lot of confounding factors will make it a difficult thing to do.
But there are a couple of things that we can know immediately. Again, I'd sort of recommend that Centre for Equitable Growth paper that teases apart some of these things. You know, in theory, the way that corporate tax cuts make low and middle income people better off over time is through investment and higher wage rates. So to the extent that every month goes past where we don't see a dramatic increase in the wage rate compared to what it would have been, we think, in the absence of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's a month in which the corporate tax cuts are just basically flowing through to shareholders. So I think that's the thing that we'll be watching for, that increase in the wage rate, and again sort of teasing apart versus baseline versus all the other things that are happening. The other thing where we were sort of promised, and Doug touched on this earlier, a sort of a near immediate impact is from that slug of one-off repatriated profits that foreign corporations had offshore. And I think, again, Doug was very careful on the way that he described it, but people in the administration less so, in the sense that they were effectively promising immediate investment in things like factories from this repatriated cash, given the one-time tax on those profits transitioning to the new system. You'll note that the story has changed somewhat to something more like Doug's story, which is, yeah, probably will go out to buybacks and then it will eventually work its way into the economy and a better allocation of investments. That's a different story than just those companies taking the money and investing in factories right here in the US. It's probably more in accord with what I would expect, and even that sort of efficiency benefit I wouldn't expect to be that great.
I mean, realistically, given the timelines for planning in those corporations, if they announced in April they're building a factory in the U.S., it was already planned to be built. I mean, so it's going to take a little while to get to the impacts.
Right. Any other questions? Yes, the woman in the back.
Hi, I'm Connie Max with Local Initiative Support Corporation. Doug, you mentioned that there's a stagnation in education, and with the tax cuts and the limitation on real estate tax deductibility of $10,000, isn't that just going to add pressure to the ability to pay teachers a reasonable wage and improve the education system in the U.S.?
It's going to have impacts on the housing market, and property taxes are an important part of the tax base at the state and local level. There's no question about that. There is the flip side, which is if you get better growth, that helps property values. It helps everything. So the net impact is always what you want to look at. Again, we'll have to see how that works out. I would also stipulate that not all of the problems are money, and we do have to get better performance out of our K-12 system. You go back to 2001, No Child Left Behind. We have done enough testing in the United States that we can identify failure in that K-12 system down to the student, the teacher, the principal, the school, the district, and the county, and the state. And those numbers have been there, and we just haven't fixed it. And that's very troubling.
And I think the other thing that states and localities should be focused on is the fact that overall there are a lot of federal tax cuts flowing through to high-income people and corporations in their states. And again, that pressure might create budget pressure on federal investments over time. They should be thinking ahead and looking to capture some of that revenue and, invest in states and localities as opposed to sort of doubling down on the tax cuts for the wealthy.
States have that opportunity, right? Because a lot of states are linked to the federal tax code. And so to the extent that the changes in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act broaden the tax base at the federal level, broadens them at the state level, it lowered rates at the federal level, but the law does nothing to rates at the state level. And so states are going through the discussion now trying to figure out if it's a windfall that they get, or should they use that and reinvest it? Should they give it back, give part of it back, or what? And that's going to be done in 40 or some state houses. They kind of run through this.
Right. We have time for one more quick question. The woman in the back.
Hi, Alina Bhatt from the National Academies. There are a number of nice examples of states that have tax credits that incentivize some type of socially good thing, such as Colorado's tax credit for companies that are investing in childcare. So I'm just wondering what you think about the possibility of innovating in those areas.
I think the real question there is, to what extent do you want to use the tax code in that way? And to what extent did you want to genuinely do a reform that broadened the base by getting rid of lots of credits for what might be socially desirable purposes, get rid of a lot of deductions that people might otherwise like, and dramatically lower rates? That's the recipe for true tax reform. We ended up in this place that is neither that nor just a pure cut, and so it's being fought out on a case-by-case basis. If I had my druthers, I'd have the tax code largely just raising revenue in a very neutral fashion, and all of those programs would be what they genuinely are, spending programs targeted on the problems we care about.
And I'm sure this will be taken up in the next panel as well, but one of the really important aspects of those sorts of approaches, including the opportunity zone approach, is monitoring and the research to sort of figure out what has happened with them.
And, right, monitoring and evaluation of those programs. Yep.
Thank you so much to the panelists, and we have a second panel that will be wonderful. So. Don't move.
We're going to have another transition moment as we invite Jane Campbell, who's going to be moderating our second panel from the National Development Council. And bear with us as we get set up. So thank you.
easier and better for low-income people. So the fact that they actually took the personal exemption and made it zero.
Right?
And I think we'll have time for some questions.
Are we alphabetical?
I think that was a good call.
No, I think That's we're on mic right now. accurate time. Okay, ready?
No, in what order are we?
Well, I can see who's really interested and who's going to stay in the room. Thank you very much for reconvening. Hold on just a moment. I have to do my Marco Rubio throw. My name is Jane Campbell, and I'm the director of the Washington office for the National Development Council, and it is a privilege to be here to moderate this panel. And I am mercifully not going to read to you the bios of the panelists because that opportunity to pick that up was outside. So if you're wondering who are these brilliant people that we're talking to, check it out, and you can find it out outside. There is one document that I would encourage you to pick up outside. We have a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is the picture of the actual appropriations investment in community and economic development since 1970 as a percentage of GDP. The red is if we adopted the president's budget. Mercifully, we didn't adopt the president's budget, but even without that, it stays about where the blue is. So you can see why this part of the panel is so important, because there hasn't been political will to make investments directly in communities and in economic development, in housing, and improving the lives of low-income communities. Many will argue that that is the most efficient, effective, and cost-effective way to do it. Congress has chosen not to do that, and the only thing they can get political will on is to do tax credit investments. Now, there could be a lot of argument about why the tax credit industry has become so popular. There are a number of people who work in the tax credit industry and earn a lot of money working in the tax credit industry. So you have an advocacy group for tax credits beyond the traditional folks who argue on behalf of low-income communities. That's just a background framework for the conversation. So our conversation today is to look at what is the impact of the tax bill on state and local governments, their ability to raise taxes, sell bonds, invest in families and low-income communities, and where do we go from here? So we start with our expert on state and local taxes. So Kim, why don't you tell us what's going on at the state and local level? There are some state and locals that are looking at, do they make their tax codes conform to the federal tax code? What's the impact of that? And walk us through what we can expect.
Okay, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. I also want to give a shout out to the prior panel, which managed to talk more about state and local governments than I think I've ever seen them do before. So what does it mean? So we have this big federal tax change. The first thing to note is that for the 40-some states that actually have a state income tax or state and local income tax, most of them use something from the federal tax system as a starting point. None of them use exactly what the federal government does. And so there's something called conformity, which means what do you accept from what the federal tax code looks like and what do you have that's different from that? So the first thing state and local governments had to do, and especially state governments needed to do, is figure out what the tax changes were going to mean to their tax codes. For most states, or a number of them, they actually will see more money coming in from their income tax if they make no changes. But before they say, great, we're getting more money in, what does this mean? How are we going to spend it? They need to figure out why they're getting that money. And so the most important reason for that is one of the big changes in this, especially on the individual side, was we expanded the standard deduction, but we got rid of personal exemptions. So if state governments use personal exemptions that are the federal personal exemptions, suddenly those are going to be set to 0. And so if you're a state like Utah, you might want to think about whether you want to keep the money that you're getting in if it basically is coming from large families because they've lost that personal exemption. Now Utah has decided that it is going to keep that, which is somewhat surprising, but it means that when states say that they're getting more money in from TCJA, it means that some of their taxpayers are going to be paying higher taxes. And so they need to figure out what that means and who that affects. And so that's just basically the mechanics of what this means. The other thing that's gotten a lot of attention is the fact that one of the big cost savings for the federal rules is the fact that it limited the state and local tax deduction. And so the SALT deduction is basically the ability of people who are itemizing to list their state and local taxes and not pay and use it to lower their federal tax burden. And so what does this mean? It's not going to directly affect the taxes that state and local governments are generating, but it might make it harder for them to maintain especially progressive taxes or to raise taxes because they're nervous that if they actually are raising taxes on high-income people within their state, that people might have incentives to leave the state. And so that's the conversation we're seeing. It's worth pointing out that for a majority of people in every state, they're actually going to see their taxes go down a little bit. So the number of people who are actually going to see their taxes increase next year is between 3 and 10%. But that varies with New Jersey getting to be the big loser in terms of having 10% of its taxpayers seeing their taxes increase. And the other, blue states that have been benefiting from the SALT deduction are the ones that see more people see higher taxes. And so basically, what it means in terms of states' ability to raise taxes, especially progressive taxes, is it means that they're not getting that benefit from the federal side. More broadly, and we're going to get into this a lot, afterward, because tax rates have gone down, so marginal tax rates for everybody and the individual tax rates have gone down, that means things like the benefit from municipal debt and some of the tax credits has gone down. And that's not necessarily bad for individuals that they're paying less in taxes, but if you're talking about things that are tax exempt or mean that you can lower your tax burden, if you have a lower marginal tax rate, that means that the returns to those kinds of credits and say muni bond, the tax exempt status of that is going to be lower. And so in general, what we're going to see are states needing to figure out what TCJA means mechanically for their taxes, but more importantly, what it means for the distribution of taxes they raise and whether it's going to put pressure on them to either lower taxes or shift the kinds of taxes that they're raising.
It's a lot to think about all at once. And I think that as we've talked in preparation for this panel, it's clear that the impact on state and local government of this Tax Cut and Jobs Act is dramatic.
Yeah, can I also say one more thing? So you'll see that we have a couple of briefs outside. So if you're interested in sort of knowing the state-by-state information and who conforms and how, in which ways, we have a brief that does that. And then we also have a brief that goes through who are the winners and who are the losers in different states based on the federal changes.
And so as we look at, this is in the same way that the earlier panel said, this is an evolving situation. We can predict what we think is going to happen, but this has a 10-year life. And so there will be immediate effects, there will be long-term effects, and some of those are as yet to be determined. But one of the things that I know this group is very interested in is during the course of the debate, there was a lot of discussion about what would happen to the tax credits that have been used for state and local governments to assist, for the federal government to assist with community economic development, new markets, historic, low-income housing tax credit. And what do we see as the impact on those credits, both what happened in the bill and what will be different for them, in the same way that you raised the question about municipal bonds being probably going to be priced higher because the impact of the tax reduction is less. What's the impact? What happened in the bill, and what's the impact? So Matt, you get to be our expert on these matters.
All right. Well, thank you, Jane. Thanks, everybody. So the big three credits. What happened in the bill? Congresswoman Sewell said something to the effect of, or I'll say it, it could have been a lot worse. I don't think we actually gained a lot with what happened with these credits. But real quickly, the housing credit, started out very optimistically. When the administration and the congressional Republicans got together and introduced their framework in early fall for what tax reform would look like, what the principles were, they actually singled out the low-income housing tax credit as something that was essential and needed to be preserved, and that was great news. And then we got hit with the House legislation, the draft, and what the House would have done was eliminate all private activity bonds. Well, about 40% of all the housing credit production is done with what they call the 4% tax credit, which is done in conjunction with the private activity bonds. So that would have wiped out about 40% of the production right there. So that was the first battle, is making sure that Congress preserved the private activity bonds. Fortunately, the Senate bill that was the Senate mark did not have that provision in there, and at the end of the day, that's what won out. So the private activity bonds were preserved. The housing credit, which itself was never in direct danger, was therefore, that piece of the credit was preserved as well. But there was, on the housing credit, there was, for me, it's more of like, well, there was a couple things that were negative. One is that there's, with the corporate rate now going from 35% to 21%, there's a lot less appetite, not a lot less, but there's less appetite. Investors aren't going to pay as much for the credit because there's not as high returns now because of the lower tax rate. And we had already seen a fear of that in the marketplace shortly after the election. When Trump was elected, the housing credit market actually dipped down. They were paying over $1 for the credits nationally. It was up to about $1, $1.02 nationally for the credits. And why you pay more than what the credit's worth is a whole other discussion, but we won't get into here. But there's other tax streams that come with having the credit. In addition to the credit stream, the deductions and losses are also of a value. So that's why if there was a thought that, wow, they might actually pass tax reform and maybe the corporate rate will be as low as 20%. So the investors immediately, the pricing went from about $1 down to about 85 cents in an initial reaction. And then with the passage of the bill, now that where we were at a high water mark of about $1 nationally for it, I think we're now down into the low 90s or so. So the market is settled, but it is 10-15% lower what they're paying. And that means less equity for the projects. That means less units could be produced, or there's bigger gaps that need to be filled, or maybe you can't target the units to the lower income populations. So there's a lot of unintended consequences with that lower rate. So even preserving the credit is not, we're still losing some ground on that. The other thing for me was the opportunity cost. Senators Cantwell and Hatch had introduced legislation in the Senate to increase the allocation of credit by 50% to the states. So basically increasing the units by 50%. This was a provision in the Bipartisan Policy Center had come up with this proposal. So there really was a lot of bipartisan support, and you can't have a better champion on the Republican side than the chairman of the Finance Committee, Senator Hatch. So we were hopeful that this and the 24 other provisions in this bill would all get included in the legislation. So there was an opportunity cost that wasn't picked up. Now we got a little bit of a life preserver thrown our way, I guess. In the omnibus bill, there was actually a tax provision. So last month that included plussing up the housing credit allocation by 12.5% for each of the next 4 years. So that helps, I guess, a little on the margins, the fact that the investors are paying less for the credit, and it will help with some of the unit production, make up some of that cost. So that's going to be very helpful. And it also included a provision called income averaging, which would allow housing credit properties to serve, it's typically the housing credit unit has to be for someone making 60% of the area median income or below, priced to that price point. It would allow some units to go, in some projects, to go as high as 80% as long as the average for the entire project remains at the 60%. So that's a tool that a lot of high market areas are interested in. It can also be very helpful in rural communities where you have less population to pull from for the wait lists. So I think that's helpful. One last thing on the housing credit, there was a provision in the tax bill called the base erosion and anti-abuse provision. It's basically an alternative minimum tax for foreign investors, and about 10 to 15% of the housing credit market is for foreign investors. Is about right now foreign-owned banks are making those investments. So it's curious to see over time. We don't know yet, but we're worried that some of that market's going to disappear because of this alternative minimum tax. That they won't be able to make full use of the credits. That's the housing credit. New market tax credits. Again, it was just about preservation. There was legislation that would have made that program permanent, and we thought this was a great opportunity for that. When the House bill came out, the program, by the way, has been set to sunset in 2019. The House legislation would have repealed the program effective 2017. So that sent out some major alarm bells. It was all we could do. The Senate bill did keep the present law, the current law, with the new market tax credit. So and that's what won out at the end of the day. So new market tax credits, we live to fight another day. We're going to hopefully make that provision permanent at some point. There may have been a positive unintended consequence too when the tax bill got rid of the corporate alternative minimum tax. That may have slowed down some appetite for the new market. So now we'll see if some new players can come into that space. So maybe there will be a little silver lining out of this, but the bigger battle will be making the program permanent. Finally, the historic tax credits that also been eliminated entirely in the House legislation. I think you all sense a theme here. The Senate bills, fortunately, did restore the credit, but there was not without changes. There used to be a 10% historic or a 10% tax credit for older properties, not certified as historic by the National Park Service, but older properties you can get a 10% tax credit for. So that's now been is currently being phased out and it's going to be eliminated. And then there's the 20% historic credit was retained, but they have made it what's called a rateable credit. So instead of getting an upfront 20% credit at the time of occupancy or the time the project's finished, you phase that in over a 5-year period. So again, like as with the housing credit, there's now a little bit less of a less of a return when you're phasing in because of the net present value. So we'll probably see some of the pricing dip on that as well.
So is the summary, Matt, that we played a great game of defense, but the offense wasn't there?
Well,
we were there, but we didn't win.
I'm looking at some of my fellow advocates. I thought we did a pretty good job on offense too, but we just couldn't. It was
well, the offense fought hard,
it
but
was too many. The defense was too strong for us. Yeah, we have Alabama and Auburn. We talked about earlier today. Strong
we had
defenses.
that conversation.
That's right. I went to Emory. I felt like I was the Emory who doesn't have a football team. And I felt I was the offensive. I was Emory's quarterback going up against the Auburn and Alabama team.
Which is why we should celebrate the fact that the defense won. But one of the reasons that we won, I think, is because an awful lot of people told stories about what do these credits mean in real communities, talk to their members of Congress, and help them to see it and understand it in real life. We have 2 panelists who are from the real life side of the world. Jerry, you're working every day in the Kentucky Highlands area. Why don't you tell us, how do these investment tools work in rural areas? Give us some Kentucky and related stories.
Well, we participated in the New Markets Tax Credit Program. We've had 3 rounds of funding. We funded rural hospitals, we funded college teaching facility expansions, and we've helped several small businesses with capital projects using that. So we were glad that program stayed around. We also led I think the only New Markets venture capital company that used those credits to leverage into some really distressed communities. Used an equity tool similar to an SBIC. Speaking of defense, Kentucky Highlands led one of the round 1 rural empowerment zones. And we were hoping that would be included in the bill. We worked hard with our representatives to lobby for that. But that's one, and I've been doing this since 1973 in rural eastern Kentucky. 20 of my 22 counties are persistent poverty counties. Haven't made much of a dent in that. It's, but the tools that have been there have been, we've been able to use have been very effective. The empowerment zone, in the first 10 years, we reduced poverty 21 points by getting jobs. The tax credits were a significant part of that. Those jobs are still there today. 1 in 9 people that live in those census tracts are still employed. Congress chose to extend that credit, and it was extended through 2017. It's a very powerful tool, and it's reaching a lot of families, and those businesses are in the community, they're entrenched, and probably 98% of those businesses are bringing revenue. They're selling their products beyond their region. Such a powerful influx of capital for that area. We also led, President Obama awarded a Promise Zone to us. And we were hoping to get Empowerment Zone-like credits with that. The Promise Zone is a promise. It had no money, and it was a promise. We've had to tell hundreds of community meetings that it's a promise because they thought we were going to get a big check, or they were going to get a big check. But what we have done, with that program, we've really worked on, if it's going to be, it's up to me. If it's your issue in your community, we've worked with that community. And the partnering we've done with it has been phenomenal. I always use census data to track. I can't doctor that or change that in any way. The best number we have out of the Promise Zone, we've increased the graduation rate of the 8 county school systems. The career and job-ready graduates from 49% to 71% in the first 3 years.
Wow.
That's working with Berea College and the other educational co-ops. And by just having the Promise Zone as a focus point, and we got 2 rounds of Promise Neighborhood funding because of the Promise Zone points that were assigned in education. So we were hoping those credits would be there, but they didn't make it.
And one more question. I noticed that you were appointed by Congressman Hal Rogers to a critical committee there. How have you engaged your congressman in understanding how these investments work in his district?
We always bring him to the ribbon cuttings. We're having our 50th year party, and the Center for Rural Development in his hometown, and he's keynoting that. We annually, I serve on 2 or 3 different boards. He's real bad for walking in by himself and just drilling us on what we haven't done. He can't ever remember what we have done. But we try to engage him. I guess I had the pleasure of starting my career in Congressman Carl Perkins' district. Very similar. They were out in the community, and they listened a lot. And the 5th district, is really challenged. We have like I said, 20 of the 22 counties I work in are persistent poverty, and he's really worked on. Right now, he's really concerned about the opioid problem. We just have a phenomenal percentage of individuals that are afflicted by that. It's no respecter of persons. High net worth families and low net worth families all seem to have a experience with that. So it's easy to engage Congressman Rogers when you talk about advancing income and advancing the tax base of his district. He really pushes us on trying to get new technologies into the district. I'm on the Tennessee Valley Corridor Board, which has, a phenomenal budget in the Redstone Arsenal and the Marshall Space Flight Center, and Oak Ridge research is there. All the nuclear stuff is stored. The stuff from Libya they brought back to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So we do have some really high-tech businesses in our neighborhood. It's just hard to get them to come over into the more distressed counties that we work in.
Well, thanks, Jerry. Now, Deputy Mayor Brian Kenner, being the Deputy Mayor of Washington, D.C., I know you can't tell us about how well you work with your members of Congress since D.C. doesn't have representation.
Not yet, but we will one day.
As a D.C. resident, I have to put that out there, you know. But tell us, how has the district, in your role as leading the planning and economic development for Mayor Bowser, how are these tools used, and how do you see them in an urban context?
Yeah, you know, like most of my colleagues, defense was the first position. I think we heard a lot about new market tax credits, private activity bonds, which was big for us, and a few other tools leaving. Defense wins championships. I want to remind people of that too, because you've got to start with a good defense in order to have offense. You've got to be able to show what kind of success you have with those tools to be able to have a story to tell other people about why you should be increasing those kinds of tools. And so in Washington in particular, where the mayor likes to say not only are we potentially a high cost city, but we're a high amenity city, affordable housing is like our #1 issue. It is the issue that she has been championing for the last 4 years or so. It is the reason why every single year we allocate $100 million of local money alone from what we call our Housing Production Trust Fund, specifically to target the majority of that money goes to 50% and under AMI communities in Washington, D.C. I think we're the largest housing trust fund per capita in the country in that way. So things like private activity bonds are incredibly important to making sure that we continue to leverage as much capital as possible to produce units. The other thing that happened in the tax bill was obviously the Opportunity Zone legislation. And you know, that's been, I think, both nationally and then sort of more micro in Washington, D.C. It's been an interesting conversation. We are actually this week about to probably release our final map.
I was going to say, have you done your map yet?
We're going to release our final map this week. We've had, if people have, which I don't anticipate people have, but we actually had an online version of our map up for about 3 or 4 weeks. We wanted to get community feedback. We had sort of a town hall with our ANC communities to sort of get feedback on where, and again, on the Opportunity Zone, it's a opportunity to designate, for us it's about 25%, or depending upon how big your state is, 25 census tracts that can be eligible to be able to benefit from a deferral of some capital gains taxes that occur. And so the sort of concept is to try to be a catalyst for investment throughout your city, but obviously targeted on census tracts that sort of need the most assistance. And so for us, it has been an interesting tension, and I think that other places also have this tension, which is, you know, we have underserved communities. Every single state, city, doesn't matter, has underserved communities. And, you know, I'm in the business of making sure that we get things to places where they are not as much interested in getting things to places where they already are. That said, there's concern when you go into those communities and say, we want to bring you a tool that can potentially bring more investment. I go to community meetings all the time. People go to community meetings out here. If you haven't, I would encourage you to go to one, because sometimes you'll be surprised about what you actually hear. I go to what we call our east of the river communities, Ward 8, Ward 7, and I have exactly 2 different people who always come and say the same things to me. One person says, Brian, how come I can't buy a pair of pantyhose in my community? Literally, she says that every time. And what she means is that west of the river and the rest of Washington, D.C., you can buy things fairly easily within a walking distance from where you live. In her community, she still can't. She still cannot do that. I have another person who says, I'm scared. I'm scared about everything that, Brian, that you represent. I'm scared that rents are going to go up. I'm afraid that either I or my kids won't be able to live in this community going forward. So I get these same two people who say kind of opposite things, because one wants more and one is afraid of what that additional investment could potentially bring. That is now sort of memorialized in this opportunity zone discussion, in that we have communities that need investment, but should we be providing, should we only target those kinds of communities in our map? And I think that where we will likely end out, and strangely enough, what we heard even back from our community feedback, is that people want that investment all over. They don't necessarily think that just targeting those completely underserved communities will be the sort of the best use of that potential tool. The other thing about it is that opportunity zones, the way that it's structured, you know, it's not an answer to everything. If you haven't seen investment for many years in your communities, 200, 300 basis point difference on your return ain't going to change that. Not going to change it one bit. What this, I think, does, though, is it potentially can flip some of those transitional neighborhoods where investment is thinking about coming but not yet there. I think that it has a high likelihood potentially of making a big impact there. It also, I think, brings up a conversation which we would like to engage in, which is, are there other priorities that the city has that we can integrate into this tool? Because I think that every jurisdiction has their ideas and concepts and things that they think are most important, affordable housing being one of our biggest ones. Right behind that would be sort of DC resident employment, and we'd love to figure out ways to continue to ingrain that in this tool as well.
So looking at how you're going to employ the opportunity zone, once you make the designation, which across the country, as we're talking to people, the challenge is, how do you find the census tracts that have both the need and the opportunity? Because the designation will only be meaningful if there's an opportunity to invest and earn enough on that investment to make it meaningful, because your initial deferral of your taxes for 10 years, you still have to pay them. So that's not enough to get someone to get up off their money. But if they make an investment believing that over that 10-year period there's going to be a significant growth which would otherwise incur capital gains, and they have no reason to pay it, that's where the real investment opportunity is. And so how have you managed that balance between opportunity and need in securing your designation?
Yeah, we've got this sort of chart that we did of every census tract in the District of Columbia that looks at sort of, we had some terms, the opportunity for investment, so whether that's small business, whether that's strip center, shopping center, whether that's another potential development that could occur there. And then we also looked at it as a percentage of total residential, because we wanted to get a sense about how effectively how dense the investment opportunity could be, with some areas having a lot of residential, small amount of potential investment, but knowing that having an opportunity to have development that can be closer to where a lot of people are located at could actually be a promising thing for some of our analysis. So to be honest with you, there's no right answer to it. I mean, I think that every jurisdiction has to sort of struggle a little bit with this tension that exists. I think that, you know, for us, what you will see is that the majority of our sites will likely be in some of our most underinvested neighborhoods, but I think that we're also thinking about some of those transitional areas where the investment could really make a difference.
Kim, I see you're anxious to get in this conversation. Tell us, how does it fit with the rest of the federal tools?
Well, I was just going to say, and this is a place where, you know, I'm going to be a little positive about what the government is doing. Like, this is something where I feel like the federal government is doing it right, in that there are these hard questions that need to be answered, and the fact that they're reaching out to states to come up with the designations and to think about which, census tracts and which places are going to be considered means that they're not saying that they have the answers, and they're recognizing at least that there are going to be people closer down to the ground who will be able to weigh in and decide what their priorities are and what this is. Because these are hard questions, right? These kinds of questions about where do you need the investment the most, but where are you actually going to be able to take advantage of the incentives that are in place are tough, and they're going to differ. We have two different places right here that are really different from each other, and figuring out what makes sense for DC versus what makes sense in Kentucky are going to be interesting questions, and they're going to be easier to answer, I think, if you have state folks involved, even if you don't have local folks involved, but you actually are hoping that there is conversation going on at that level where they're actually going to have those kinds of conversations and figure out what works best for their own communities.
I think that is optimistic in some ways. It's also, become controversial because the people making the designation are the governors.
Right, well,
and
that is
so
where
you have some issues in some states where the mayors believe that they have a particular, I was a former mayor, so I'm all about mayors. In DC, it's one and the same, but there's a little bit of controversy about that, but it is what it is. I guess we've talked a lot about the designation of the zones, which is going to be set by April 21st for 10 years. So we maybe should move to the next question. And Matt, you've been looking at this from a national perspective, which is we want to create opportunity funds. They're required to be certified by the IRS. IRS has indicated the rules will be, on a priority basis and come out in June. What do you know about what's under consideration for the rules, and what are your concerns, thoughts, hopes?
Right. So I haven't heard June yet. I may have missed something, but I know they are working very quickly and deliberately because there is a time value of money with this. The taxpayers have to they can defer up until December of 2026, I believe. Then they have to pay their taxes on that deferred amount. So there's definitely an incentive to get this up sooner than later, get the investments in there, because the longer they can defer, obviously the more value that is of them from a tax benefit. So there's definitely a lot of eagerness for the IRS to put out their rules. But there was this major tax bill that was just passed. So I imagine the IRS is doing some other things as well right now.
They did put it on their priority, when they published their priority list that
right.
said things were going to be done by June 30th.
Yeah.
Now,
we'll call Mark back up to the panel to say how well IRS does at meeting that priority list. But
say,
that's the June you're referring to.
Yes, that's
right.
where I came up with
That
June.
is absolutely right.
It's a bit optimistic, but
that's right.
we have to live and dream here.
So, but they will. I think they are working very deliberately to do this, and what they. So yeah, the zone part was kind of like to some of the frustrations of actually personally of LISC and I think other groups that I don't think that Treasury exercised its full rights that they could have exercised in the conference agreement of the report that gave them some opportunities to maybe have the states identify why are they choosing these zones. There was certain criteria that the conference report suggested states should be using. So I was a little disappointed that they weren't as activist as they could have been in enforcing that with the states. So the opportunity zones, it turned into be, it's really looking like just a check the box exercise. Does the math work? The states are allowed to identify up to 25% of their eligible low-income communities to be in these zones, and there's a little wiggle room for up to another 5% of are adjacent to the qualifying census tracts. They can pull some of those in. So it looks like all Treasury is doing is getting this from the states and then turning around and saying, okay, this is your zones. And so far, 15 states have been approved, and three, I think, 3 of the other jurisdictions. So 18 total now have been approved by Treasury. Some asked for an extension until April 22nd, so including DC. So I imagine very shortly after Treasury will announce the rest of the state zones. I don't think there'll be a whole lot of delays at that point. And then the next step is if you want to invest in these, if you want to collect the money from investors and put the money into the zones, you have to do it through a qualified opportunity fund. So those will get certified by the Treasury Department as well. But I would, for those of us that are more used to a CDFI fund or new market tax credit certification space where there's a little bit of meat behind the bones, I'm a little concerned as well that there isn't going to be much of a certification of the funds beyond the fact of, is this group legally exist, and are they committed to making investments into the zone? And there's a requirement that 90% of the fund's holdings have to be in the opportunity zones, which is you can't really determine that at the time they become certified because they haven't yet made the investment. So you got a little bit of chicken and egg thing going on. So I think that's the next step, is they're going to put out rules about certifying these funds. I don't expect to see a lot there. And then the final piece of kind of the rulemaking for IRS to address is what qualifies as these investments. It looks pretty straightforward in the statute, but then there's a host of other questions that come up about what is a qualifying business and things like that. Can you recycle the investments right now? And this could be a major shortcoming of the program for venture capital for business investing, is that if your business exits the transaction, we have a period to reinvest that money so that you can take the full advantage of the whole deferral, or does that count as cashing it out? And so I think that really needs to critically be addressed. Preferably would have been done in the statute, but maybe the IRS can do something through the regulatory process. So those are the kind of questions that need to get answered. I don't want to put a timeline on it, but I do think they are earnestly working on this stuff.
There's no question that those are going to be issues that are, Jerry, from your perspective, is there anything you have your eyes on in terms of the certification of opportunity funds? Is Kentucky Highlands thinking about creating one, or what's your thoughts on that?
I mentioned we've operate equity funds.
Mm-hmm.
Equity is really hard to put out in rural America, or we found it to be. Kentucky had almost 600 census tracts that were eligible. The bill mentioned promise zones. The planning that you do around the promise zone is a sort of a targeted, no priority or points, but it was something they suggested that the governors consider when they looked at this. We thought we were on the fast track, but we weren't. We worked with our local officials in the promise zone and identified tracts that qualified, but that had growth opportunities, that had utilities, maybe some industrial park space. Maybe we knew of a project or two that really could use this kind of funding. We ended up getting 15 tracts in our zone. The state map, I've got it, the governor spread it around. You can see the blue is the ones that got it and the white's the ones that didn't. But Kentucky's a pretty big state, and the geography's immense, but there's I believe there's 144 zones that have been designated and approved by Treasury. So we think we're going to work with LISC. We're a member of Rural LISC, and we don't want to take on the Treasury designation and all that comes with that. We'd rather work from the community side of developing projects and then go to national groups like LISC that have the ability to identify the investors and follow the regulations. I mentioned we've run some new markets funds. We ran several different programs that are quite complicated, and there's a real cost to administering those things, and I like to call it keep Jerry out of jail, because I'm the one that signs the returns and sends the credits out to the investors and that sort of thing. So I think on this program, that's what we're going to try to do. We've got a total of 27 tracts in our 22 counties that are eligible. So
now, many of the current tax credits, the primary investors are corporations, banks that have community reinvestment reasons to invest, and similar types of investors. As you look at the opportunity funds, do you think we'll see a different class of investor enter into the fray? Kim, with your background in understanding tax policy, did the tax bill change who might be interested in investing in, whether it's the opportunity fund or whether it's other tax credits? Do we have a new marketing place to go for investors?
Do you think that?
I'll try it, and then you guys can. I don't think so, and the reason why I don't think so is because the program is not transformational. It's not. It will make a difference, but it will not turn something that's really, really no to a yes. And so I always feel like the places that have seen traditionally less investment, you're going to have a different class of investor already there versus those places that are easier to invest or those marginal places. And so I feel like the program is most impactful in that sort of middle ground. And in that middle ground, I think that those investors tend to be just a little bit more opportunistic, but they tend to be your typical, at least I see it on the equity side, your typical equity investors that are looking for that opportunity. They just need a little bit more of a push. They need a little bit more debt to equity. They need a little bit more of something to make it worth their while. So from my perspective, at least in Washington, D.C., I don't necessarily know if I expect to see a tremendous amount of different investors come in just because of opportunity zones.
We also have an opportunity for you all to ask questions. So
I just want to follow on that point.
But not until Matt speaks first.
That's a lie.
We got to get clear.
I think one of the objectives of this, of the architects, was to get a new group of investors in, like the high net worth individual investors. You pointed out that historically in the credits, the new markets, LIHTC, it really is these kind of the investors of the banks and that world, the financial institutions are the big investors. But now we're talking about, and Sarah mentioned this in her remarks, this uncapped credit, $2.3 trillion of unrealized capital gains are out there. And a lot of them are held by wealthy individuals who want to, hopefully, there's enough of them out there that also will accept maybe lower returns than they had been getting from their Amazon and Microsoft stocks because they want to do the right thing in these neighborhoods. And they want to, so that would be a sea change in the investors. I think it's way too early to say, but that's, I'm optimistic, I'm cautiously optimistic we're going to see at least some of that activity.
We've nicknamed it the unearned income tax credit. So you have the earned income tax credit and the unearned income tax credit. Now wait, who's got the mic? All right, let's start in the front. You know, if you sit in the front, it's like church. It means either you came late or you're on the program.
Good. I actually got told to sit up here, so that worked to my advantage. Hi, I'm Tina Stacy from the Metropolitan Housing Communities Policy Center here. My question is mostly for Brian, but for everybody. The whole fact that, or the idea that the opportunity zones are going to work best in these neighborhoods that are kind of maybe already on the brink of potentially developing. The thing, you know, obviously coming from Metro, and I hear you saying this as well, is that I immediately am concerned about and worried about is displacement. So I'm wondering how you're balancing and how you're thinking about potentially trying to get those investments in neighborhoods where it might actually have an impact, but also where there's not likely to be a lot of displacement of low-income residents. So are you thinking about, you know, areas where there's room for growth without the displacement of residents, or areas where potentially there's already infrastructure in place to preserve affordable housing and allow for gentrification in place?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know if there's any way to stop, I don't know if there's any way to stop displacement, as you said, like these zones that, well, maybe places where it doesn't happen as much. I think that the way that I like to think about it is, so what else can we be doing? And that is sort of this idea that we're starting to sort of think about a little bit is, if we do designate these zones, are there additional resources that the city's willing to commit to those areas to say, we understand that in these areas in particular there could be greater opportunities for investment, and so we want to make sure that affordable housing, we want to make sure that small business formation, we want to make sure that we're focused on DC residents getting jobs. Are there ways that we can particularly impact those communities such that when we see that investment that we can try to be a part of it? I mean, we've tried, you know, home buyers clubs. We've tried, you know, maybe we allocate a larger percentage of our housing production trust fund actually to some of those communities. Like, I think there are ways that we are trying to mitigate as much as possible the potential impact, but also recognize that, as I said in my community meeting example, not every resident thinks the same way. If you go east of the river today, the last thing they want to hear from me sometimes is affordable housing. They say, we've got enough. Brian, where's the market rate housing? Where's the 80% of AMI housing? Because that's what I want. Where's the home ownership opportunities? And it is very difficult to give home ownership opportunities if you're targeting 50% of AMI individuals. So like, it is not just one voice that we are trying to be responsive to.
Can I just add, given it's tax day? So something I think DC does really well, and it isn't about investment, but the fact that DC has low-income housing credit, that it's expanded, but it also makes available to renters, means that, you know, I volunteer as a VITA person, and in DC, you can actually see, you know, some of these families that are struggling, that have lower income, either own their house and they're worried about what their property taxes look like, or they're paying rent that's getting higher, and they can get a significant amount of money back from DC because there is this refundable tax credit. So there's also this question about how places set up not only sort of what they're doing on the investment side, but how they basically take into account the other programs or other options they have to try and make it a broader set of people who are benefiting from something. And I feel like the Schedule H is one of the things that DC is doing pretty well right now.
One of the interesting things is we have people online who are asking questions, and one of our online folks was asking what amounts to a really technical question that we don't have the answer to yet, which is, can you, with your Opportunity Fund, capitalize a business that has headquarters in the Opportunity Zone, but also operates in another area? These are the kind of questions that are going to come up as we go through the rulemaking process. So I highlight it just to recognize that for those of you out there in the online world, we are listening to you, but rather than make up an answer, we would prefer that we would say, let's just wait until we know the answer. How about this gentleman with the glasses?
Thank you, Rick Rybeck with Just Economics. Thank you, very good panel. I'm a big proponent of place-based techniques for providing assistance to distressed communities, but we have an environment in which sort of no good deed goes unpunished. And I think the last question, which was talking about gentrification, I mean, this keeps getting raised. So we see a community that could use transit investment. If we actually are successful in improving transit there, land values go up and the people we wanted to help are displaced, and we end up enriching landowners who were probably already pretty affluent to begin with. Enterprise zones, which we tried before, which lowered, let's say we lowered taxes so that a business made $100 more profit each month than they would have otherwise. So a landlord can induce a business to move across the line from out of the zone to in the zone simply, and they can raise their rent by $80 a month. The business still makes $20 a month more. So the lion's share ends up going to landowner, not necessarily to the business to whom it was intended. And I'm wondering whether any of the panelists are familiar with value capture or other types of techniques that can take sort of the this unintended, unearned, if you will, unearned increment away from land speculators and return that to the community so that these community-created benefits, whether it's from transit or enterprise zones or opportunity zones, ends up going to the community to which it's intended.
So I'll just take the value capture question. I'm actually on the board of the Lincoln Land Policy Institute, which is dedicated to looking at the value of land, including land capture. And through our sustainable municipal finance practice, there is an online tool that you can look at in 200 communities across the country to try to understand what is the incremental value. The theory of land value capture, if you haven't, it is not like capture the flag. The theory is that if you own a property and the municipality makes an investment that improves the value of your property, whether that's a metro stop, a brand new recreation center built next door, new infrastructure in terms of roads and beautification, that value that accrues to you as the landowner is really a public good, and that we ought to be able to capture that value for the public good.
Right.
And that's something that is actually not a federal issue in most instances. It is a state and local issue, and there's a lot of really creative things going on with state and local government. Kim, you're a state and local government tax expert.
And I think in part places are trying to do a better job when they do things like tax increment financing and trying to figure out how much of any growth is, you know, reflected to the investment from the business side versus how much should be captured in terms of new taxes for the state or local government. Typically this is local governments. This also gets into different questions when you think about things like economic development policies more broadly. What money do you give up to try and get businesses to go into your area to try and encourage growth? And what are you forgoing for that? And I think in some sense, some of what we're doing and what we see in economic development more broadly is trying to get places to actually look hard and ask the hard questions about what is the value of what they're giving up when they're thinking about some of these deals, especially if you think about something like the Amazon deal and what does that mean for the existing people versus a broader set of people. Now, it is worth pointing out that some of these questions, and part of what sort of is interesting in a place like the United States, is these questions and what you're considering are going to be really different for someone like Terri than for what, right? So if you're talking about Kentucky versus DC, you're talking about really different questions, and you're trying to figure out how do you have the best policies to encourage the kind of growth and have the investment and the services available that can grow your different economies.
And so one of the real opportunities when you look at the broader range of value capture is that if you can capture the value that's added to the land and put it into a general fund, you then have the opportunity to redistribute that to the most low income. Because as one of our online folks raises, much of the housing investment that the federal government makes is dedicated to the deal, to creating the deal and making the deal happen, and the actual tenants who may have a Section 8 voucher and not be able to find a place that will take it, or have need for living wage jobs, and the whole question that the deputy mayor raised with regard to DC residents having employment, that if some of that value is captured and then the community can use it for additional investments targeted to those who are most in need. Sir, with the blue shirt.
It's both blue and white. My name's Cliff Kellogg, and I'm interested in what the panel thinks about the geographic dispersion of the designated census tracts. I thought when Jerry held up his map, you just see that in contrast to the New Markets tax credit, where about a third of the country is eligible, here you're taking only 25% of the eligible tract, so it's a really small portion. And I wonder what kinds of investments maybe Jerry and Brian are thinking about will be promoted by this, or which ones you would like to see promoted by this. Do you see it primarily as a venture capital type investment in an operating business, or do you see a capital gains from being a partner in a real estate related project?
Good question. Jerry, Brian, you got that question.
You go first.
All right, I'll go first.
The deputy mayor takes it on.
Yeah. So this is an easy one. Not sure yet. I think it's probably the way that I would say that. You know, I will say that I'd heard and sort of the general description of opportunity zones that there is this concept around operating businesses, that there is sort of a, not a prioritization, but the concept that this is really supposed to be helping business formation was a part of it. I will just tell you that the primary people who seem to be interested in this are real estate people. They are very, I think they are thinking about how this can be impactful to the land and development opportunities that they see in particular places. So at least that's the feedback that I've heard. I've had very few individual business owners come and say, I really, really am interested in how opportunity zones might be impactful to my business specifically here. So I think that, you know, trying to create a landscape, trying to create, you know, if this is sort of starts as a real estate sort of interest, what kinds of other things can we help promote within that real estate development that can help with business formation, I think is something that DC in particular would be interested in doing.
Jerry.
From where I'm set, real estate investments providing long-term gains in a population that's leaving, you know, you really got to have some slick accountants to sell that deal. We think, I mentioned we've used equity as a tool, and we think if we can work with a fund, we might help them identify deals that can bring that hockey stick or the gain. I see the real benefit of this is the gain on the 10-year investment. And when we've done equity, we haven't been able to time that exit at exactly 10 years in one day. So we think that's going to be a challenge, but we think that's the best opportunity for what we're trying to do. And the issue about, in the empowerment zone, they finally said, or the rule said, the job has to be in the district and the individual has to live in the district if you get the credit. We don't have that with opportunity zones yet.
So we are up against our time, and I want to tell you that I'm sure that this is an ongoing conversation. And so I hope you will join me in thanking LISC and the Urban Institute for bringing this distinguished group together. Jerry Ricketts from Kentucky, Dr. Kim Rubin, Deputy Mayor Brian Kenner, and Matt Joseph from LISC. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We have had a very full morning, so I'm grateful to everyone. A couple more thanks. I'm Brett Theodos at the Urban Institute. Thanks to LISC. Again, you're a terrific partner in this. The event came together really easily and quickly. I had a few closing remarks. I thought since you've been sitting for 3 hours, we could have a 30-minute lecture on supply-side economics. No, just a quick thanks. I wanted to reframe us in terms of where we're at. We spent a long time talking about opportunity zones, but we've still had a meaningful erosion of the LIHTC program here, and I think we need to keep thinking about that going forward. On opportunity zones, I've been doing calculations in terms of which zones were selected, and the distribution of zones selected compared to the distribution of eligible looks like there was some modest targeting. So we see a little bit lower income, a little bit lower home ownership rates, a little bit lower percent white in the tracks that were selected. So there's more to come, but we'll certainly be watching those. Just want to pick up Jerry's point quickly. I agree. We've heard about the temporary deferral. I think it's really the permanent exclusion that's going to be the big economic driver here. And even though the intention was on the business side, I agree. I think we're going to see a lot on the real estate side. And all this in the context of, you know, community development block grants standing at 22% of its all-time peak, the home program standing at 40% of its peak. So there's a lot going there. But to tie this together to the first panel, you know, we are still in the midst of, really in some ways at the early stage of some very big macroeconomic and demographic changes. There's 10,000 baby boomers who are retiring today, and 10,000 tomorrow, and 10,000, you know, every day for the next few days. And so we really do have a need to spur productivity growth. We really are talking about the size of the pie, as well as addressing how big some of the slices are. We've got a federal budget on the tax side and the spending side that prioritizes income maintenance rather than asset building and growth, that prioritizes older individuals over children. And that's true even regardless of talking about distributional effects by income. And we've got deficits that I think many on the right and the left would agree are not sustainable. So we'll end by saying the Tax Cut and Jobs Act represents a big change in a number of directions, including more on the community and local side. We're going to be here to study it. We are excited to be in dialogue with you along the way. And thanks so much for coming and sticking with us, to those on the web and those in the room. Thanks.